Okay, after some technical difficulties, which I'm now revealing, I think we're live. That was a little close to Ryan. That's okay. Well, good morning. Today is April 27th, 2024. Another Saturday free school. And today we're going to, there's a lot to talk about, some of which is continuing from last week. But we're going to first begin with Jeremiah's article, the second issue of Avant-Garde, which we just published at our April event. His article entitled Why We Must Inherit the Third American Revolution. And then after that discussion, Doc will lead a discussion about the national world transition toward a new democracy, peace, and anti-imperialism. And then attached to that, some people who went to the University of Pennsylvania encampment in solidarity with Palestine, which is popping up around the nation at different campuses. Noreen, Kathy, whoever else went to the encampment can give a little report back on what's happening there, especially in discussion with Doc's remarks on the national world moment. And then lastly, we'll come back to what we began discussing last week, which is the Tagore event in India, the art exhibit that just opened, as well as an upcoming event this weekend in India, and then as well as news, national, international coverage of that Tagore event. So there's a lot to talk about, so which is good. But I'll give it to Jeremiah to begin the discussion.
Yeah, I guess I'll try to be concise about talking about the essay because it's a pretty long essay, maybe too long, I don't know. But I think I just wanted to start by addressing why I wrote the essay in the first place, because I don't know if it's immediately obvious to people who have read it. But part of it was that, in basically addressing this question of defining the civil rights movement as the third American Revolution, I wanted to take time to work out for myself, but also in general, ideas that the Free School has been discussing for several years, especially this concept of the third American Revolution and where that places us today in terms of the prospects for a fourth American Revolution. And so that was part of it. Like I'd been thinking about like that concept of the third American Revolution together with everyone here for a while. And then in particular was thinking about how do we interpret the question of nonviolence, especially because it was so central to the civil rights movement. But I think there's still so much that has yet to be explored and understood and studied about what nonviolence really meant in that time and what new possibilities it creates for this moment. So I was also thinking about that as well. And so it'd been kind of like in my brain for like a year or so, especially since the 10th anniversary. And so I wanted to like take time to actually like put everything together. And so that was part of it. And the other reason why I wanted to write it in particular now is because, I think something that you realize when you, like, for instance, like reading Black Reconstruction in America by Du Bois, or even like looking at, a figure like King or Baldwin during the movement, something that I realized is that, especially in times of crisis, people are pushed in many ways to try to make sense of the history that produced them. And so like with Du Bois, part of my understanding of even like what was driving him to write Black Reconstruction was like he was facing essentially the world crisis of capitalism, and especially in the United States, the Great Depression. And so he was also trying to make sense of how did we get to this point, both, because he was also basically born, I think, like 3 years after the end of the Civil War, in 1968. 1868, sorry. And so he was also a child of the Civil War and of Reconstruction. And so in a lot of ways, like he was trying to make sense of, one, the history that had produced him, but also how it had produced Black folk, but ultimately how it had produced like this world crisis. And so he's going through both the revolution that was Reconstruction, but also the counter-revolution that followed, and what were the consequences of that, and how did that lead to something like the Great Depression. And similarly, when you look at King, he has that famous essay or that famous speech that he gave honoring Du Bois. And similarly, when King was also dealing with, the civil rights movement moving to a higher stage of its development, he was almost, it wasn't just, I think, like the anniversary of Du Bois's centennial, but also I think King recognizing like, oh, we have to return to essentially the Second American Revolution, Reconstruction, in order to make sense of what's possible for this revolution that we're a part of. And I think to like kind of tie things together, like with us, obviously in the free school, we've been thinking about this for a long time, but I think it's not just the free school, but I think in various ways, different sections of American society today, especially young people, or it's almost like they're being forced back towards the memory of King. It's not something that's totally clear to them yet. And I think this is something we'll like talk about with the encampments, especially. But that's what I've been thinking about. And so I wanted to make all of that very clear and very upfront, where part of what I'm trying to argue is that regardless of your background at this point, all people in the United States at this point, all of us are children of the Third American Revolution, but we also suffer from the consequences of the counter-revolution that basically overturned the civil rights movement with the assassination of King. And so I wanted to make sense of all that. And I think basically what I was trying to do with the essay was, I feel like we have developed over time certain assumptions about like King, about Du Bois, about Baldwin, about the Black freedom movement. And I wanted to take time to actually like put to the fore, like, okay, these are our assumptions. Like, what are the assumptions that actually also prevent young people, especially, from fully recognizing their own revolutionary inheritance? And so, as part of that, like I was trying to weave, like kind of put together a few basic things which I feel like are very important to free school. One of which is, again, like the centrality of Du Bois, King, Baldwin as kind of, obviously we turn to other people like Robeson, for instance. But I feel like for us, like for free school, it's in particular those three who kind of are the cornerstone of our thought. And that's not an arbitrary thing, but it's the result of like one, like objective American history, but also, like it's a political statement to say like, oh, like, yes, like it's fine to, like if you want to read Marx, that's fine. But like for us, it's not just like, oh, like, let's say, because I know like for instance, like Midwest Marx will talk about like Du Bois as like together with like Marx and Engels and Lenin and stuff. And like it's cool, but I think for us it's very important to say explicitly, like, no, like we can study other people, but our anchors are Du Bois, Baldwin, and King, and there's a reason for that. So I wanted to talk about that. I also, as I was writing, Doc was also bringing up this question of revolutionary chronology, and I was realizing that was a really important question because I think a lot of leftists in the United States today, like you said, they start basically their chronology of recent revolutionary history with 1917 and the Russian Revolution. But it's like you don't even recognize the fact that it was the Second American Revolution which helped make possible the October Revolution in Russia. And that it was like Du Bois is saying, this was a revolution on a world scale that had world implications and reverberations. And so I wanted to talk about that as well, where it's like our assumptions start from like not even just 1776, but especially from the Second American Revolution with the Civil War and Reconstruction, because in part like that more than any other recent like revolution in world history has helped shape like this current like basically like the contemporary epoch in which we live. So I wanted to talk about that and try to address that. And then the other, I'm just going through the essay, but the other question that then I was trying to address was like this question of time and consciousness and history, where I think this was partially, these are kind of either assertions or arguments that I'm trying to make. And also like I wanted to write it so that we like, there could be discussion about it. But part of what I was interpreting from like now moving into the Black freedom movement and the civil rights movement is that I think if you take a step back from things and you're like looking at it like from a third person or objective point of view, it's not immediately obvious why 1955 with Montgomery would be the point at which basically a revolutionary movement would start in the United States, because this is coming after the end of the Second World War, and this is a period in which there's, America itself is kind of on the ascendancy as a world power. And, especially with like the kind of subduing of Europe that happened after the end of the Second World War, like America, like manufacturing and like industry was basically like unmatched on the world stage. And there was a lot of, like, I feel like many people depict the 1950s as a time of like relative prosperity for the United States compared to, let's say, like a moment like the Great Depression, which is like much more clearly like a world crisis and a domestic crisis as well. And so I wanted to try to explore, why did this movement start in 1955 in Montgomery? And part of how I was trying to make sense of it was that it's not like you can't predict quote unquote revolutions just by the existence of like an economic crisis, for instance. Like not all economic crises produce a revolution, and I think that like this is something that I also want to work out with you guys, but like part of my interpretation of why this happened, this started in 1955 with King and the Montgomery movement, was that one, that Black people were not just looking at what was happening internally inside the United States, but were seeing what was happening globally with basically the wave of the anti-colonial movements, which basically like kind of swept over the world, also the Soviet Union and the role that it played in World War II. But I think part of what Baldwin talks about very explicitly, what King talks about very explicitly, what like James Lawson talks about very explicitly, is that like, oh, Black people were looking to what was happening in Africa and Asia, and they were seeing that basically the period of colonialism was coming to an end. And that then placed a question for Black people to like basically be like, okay, like it's been almost 100 years since emancipation. Like, what are we going to do? Especially at a time when the darker peoples of the world are on the move. Like, are we going to move with them? And I think that that is an important, it's like there's stuff underneath that, which I think is really important. And I actually, Nandita's essay in the journal, in the second issue, also addresses this, maybe I think in a clearer way than that view, but that it's not just, again, it's not just like, an economic crisis which can spur a revolutionary movement, but it's also the categories and conditions of people's consciousness of themselves and of their place in history, which can propel and basically like kickstart a revolutionary movement. And so like, so the thing that I feel like part of what was happening at the time was, one, Black people were looking to the world movement and the world anti-colonial movement in particular, with India, China, all of the, like Patrice Lumumba in Africa, like Baldwin talks about this, how like Black people in Harlem, like were basically rioting when Patrice Lumumba was killed, by the Belgians and by the US in tandem and stuff like that. And also connected to that was basically what King talks about in his second major book, Why We Can't Wait, which I think was published in like 1963, where King says very explicitly, Black people are conscious of the fact that it's been 100 years since emancipation, and they realize how 100 years after emancipation, they're still not free. And it's like, it's almost like it's like a wake-up call. It's like a shock to their system to be like, oh, like we actually have to do something. Like we can't, obviously there had been like countless efforts, legal efforts, all these things. Also Du Bois is part of like NAACP leading up to that moment. But it's like for King, he was like, oh, like it's actually also people's consciousness of their role in history, of their place in history, and where they come from, that helps to create the conditions for basically the audacity to take on like a new revolutionary imperative. And so that was another question that I was trying to work out. And then I don't want to go too long, but I think like I was saying before, a big question that like I am trying to deal with and to try to explore, and I think that all of us in free school right now are trying to explore, is this question of nonviolence and what nonviolence really meant. Because I think that especially for our generation, like if you grow up in the United States, like especially like like Gen Z, like all these like basically like younger people in the US, it's like I feel like our main conception of nonviolence is just that it was like a form of protest, basically,
Right.
and that this then conditions like what people think of as like, oh, like this is what like radical politics is, like just protest. And I think that part of what I think King and Baldwin, but also Du Bois bring out is that nonviolence is not just a form of protest, but it was a social process. It was an ideological process. It was essentially a democratic process. And so I was also basically comparing how, like, let's say, like Lenin, right on the eve of the Russian Revolution, was able to see what was already happening organically with the Soviet councils that had formed by like Russian workers, and was basically with that, based on what he was seeing, like almost like imminent within that organic like form, like the organic formations of like Russian workers, able to say like with confidence, like yeah, we can achieve like what basically the rest of Europe has not been able to achieve yet. And basically, like he saw the seeds of like a new democratic socialist state in like basically what was already happening. And so I think this is where I think I also am not totally sure if it's like the best comparison, but I was basically trying to compare that with how King also, with what was happening with nonviolence, where it's not just a thing of like, yeah, like Black people protesting against injustice, but literally Black people forcing a new kind of social relationship between Blacks and whites, and also amongst Black people. Because I think that, you know, part of what comes out when you study people like Diane Nash, for instance, from the national student movement, is how much nonviolence forced, like especially younger Black people, but also like across generations, forced Black people to transform themselves to, you know, and how much. So basically, I was trying to make an argument that nonviolence has to be understood, especially in the American context, as a social process and as creating the seeds for basically a new kind of democratic consciousness in the United States. And so this is where I think things are also like, it's really important to understand basically, or where I was trying to understand also like the dialectical quality of this, where I think it is true on the one hand that like King and the movement were trying to basically force the existing kind of bourgeois American state to honor what it had already said in terms of, oh, like we want equal protections under the law, we want equal enfranchisement, all of that stuff, you know, civil rights. But at the same time, what was also happening in a dialectical way was basically the movement was also creating the seeds of basically like higher stage of democracy. And the question was like, what was the relationship between these movements that were happening at the same time? And that's where I think, yeah, like these are questions that like I want to work out together with you all, because I think it's really important to understand, especially for this moment. And yeah, like I think other things that I tried to engage with in the essay is what Baldwin says is like the question of the human heart and why this was a particular quality of the American revolutionary process in particular, where like part of when Baldwin is describing the role of King, he's saying like, you know, we've talked about this a lot, but just that what King was able to do was to take the battle of basically freedom and of the future of the American people and of, you know, the Black-white relationship also directly into the domain of the human heart. And that this was something which was a revolutionary imperative for that time. And it wasn't, and this is where I think also our generation, especially like young leftists and like so-called radicals, we have this thing of like, oh, morality is like a bourgeois thing, or morality is like a liberal thing. And we're not really comfortable talking about morality because we think it's more about like bread and butter issues. And I think that part of what the civil rights movement showed is that actually morality first was something that the Black proletariat claimed as their, it's like this is where we place our flag. Like this is our question to deal with, this question of morality. Because in part also what King was seeing and what the movement was seeing was that, especially with the war in Vietnam and as that was escalating, like King was seeing like this was not just a crisis of, you know, the American system, it was basically a crisis of civilization and a crisis of like Western civilization, but also where America stood in relationship to the West. And so yeah, basically I'm trying to make the argument that King in particular was making the claim that the question of morality belongs to the people, and it is up to the people to decide what is truly moral. And that is where basically also a new kind of like democratic spirit can emerge, and also a new kind of civilization can emerge. And basically, and then try to end by talking about, yeah, like I said, the counter-revolution that happened with the assassination of King in 68. What were the consequences of that counter-revolution, especially in terms of, like, one, I was trying to deal with like the Black Power generation and the extent to which they like had a lot of revolutionary zeal and enthusiasm, but didn't fully, it's like, at least to me, this is how I was interpreting it. They didn't fully at the time recognize the importance of what King was doing and the importance of what nonviolence actually meant, and saw it as, again, like kind of like a quaint, almost naive thing. Like I feel like part of what was also driving me to write this, because I feel like especially in the context of Gaza and Palestine, a lot of young people are basically turning to like figures like Kwame Ture, like Sophie Carmichael, and being like his quotes about like, oh, nonviolence is like, and I feel like it was kind of dishonest on his part because he was part of Sting and he saw what was happening. And yeah, so I was trying to address that as well. But the other part of it too was this question of what basically white America and how white America was in one sense like almost like they were also wounded by the assassination of King, but they didn't fully recognize it. And that was in part because, especially with this is like my interpretation of this historical moment, but especially when King took the stand against the Vietnam War, like a lot, I think that was basically the point at which basically like middle America, what I think Nixon called like the silent majority, and this was basically like the great mass of like white America, they basically turned their back on King. And they turned their back on like what the movement was trying to do. And they basically were like, no, like we can't go this far with you. And this was also in some sense a kind of turning back or almost a betrayal in that sense. And at the same time, like the tragedy of it is that white people didn't even fully realize what they had lost with King. In the same way that I think we're also trying to deal with like actually what did the assassination of King really mean? And how much of a wound was that in the soul of the American people? And yeah, so I just end by trying to bring it back to our generation where, again, we are, on one hand, have been born into a period of counter-revolution. Like, let's say if you're born in the 90s, like we were. One, you're born in a period in which the Soviet Union is almost dealt with as like a far-off historical thing that has no relevance for you. But also it's really hard to develop an actual relationship with like basically your inheritance, which is the civil rights movement. And at the same time, part of the complexity of this moment is that the civil rights movement made so much of what is happening right now possible, where it's like, there's no way, I was thinking about this. It's like, a lot of, also like, the students in Columbia right now, like they're directly saying like we're inspired by the 1968 anti-war movement that took over Columbia and occupied Columbia with, was that like SDS, I think?
Oh yeah.
There's like the new left, like that whole thing. But I think what we have yet to recognize as a generation is that 68 was only possible because of 1960 and the national student movement and what James Baldwin was observing with like in Tallahassee, Florida, for instance, with the Black College there. And so we're still trying to work these things out, but it's like part of what is really exciting about this moment is that, even while the civil rights movement was overturned, it still achieved really important things especially for the American people in terms of our consciousness, where like, like Doc has said this before, but it's like, Americans are not as racist as they were in 1955. And like, yes, obviously there is still racism in the United States, especially in terms of like the ruling class. And, especially I think like this question of Zionism has brought out a lot of racism, to be honest, in the current like Gaza war. But like part of what has also happened is like there's no way that, for instance, like Trump could ever happen if not for something like the civil rights movement. There's no way that like all of these masses of Americans could be so completely fed up with the current political system and basically completely distrustful of the US ruling elite if not for the civil rights movement. And so like part of what I think is like the task of like our generation is like to decide like, oh, like do we see ourselves as inheriting the third American Revolution, or otherwise are we going to basically be almost like lost in time? And so yeah, that's part of what I was, I guess, like a lot of questions that I was trying to deal with. But I was trying to put together, I think, a lot of questions that like I've been thinking about, but also things that we've been talking about for the past several years in free school, and to also make it immediate for this moment, and to also feel like, something that I think we've said this before, but something that I felt really strongly about with the second issue of Avant-Garde is like, the way that Michelle said it too, where it's like, it's one thing to just be like, oh, like, to deal with like, quote unquote, the standards. So like, we uphold the centrality of King and Du Bois and Baldwin, but it's like, it's another thing for us where I think we're trying to also explore and discover almost like undiscovered like territory in this country in particular. And part of I should have said this at the beginning, but part of the method that I was trying to develop with this essay was in the way that Du Bois does Black Reconstruction, where his approach to it is like, I think it's like inductive rather than deductive, where he's like, I don't want to just ask this question like, oh, was the civil rights movement a revolution or not? Was the Civil War and Reconstruction a revolution or not? Instead, he's like, let me try to understand and explore what actually almost organically emerges from this revolutionary period, and try to understand like what that means in terms of the possibilities for today, and to not come into it with like all of these assumptions, but actually to be like, what does it mean if our assumptions start from what actually happened, and then where does that leave us for today? I don't know if I'm making myself totally clear in terms of that, but yeah, like I was thinking a lot about basically like, yeah, like where we are right now in terms of the history of this country, and what is the task that confronts, especially, yeah, like this generation of Americans. Because, yeah, I think the question of, yeah, like again, like with this question of nonviolence, like this is also what I was also trying to make sense of also free school practice, like political practice in some ways, where part of what I feel like we try to do and what we're striving to do is to create a space in the city of Philadelphia, in particular, where the people can come together and actually work out democratically like actual questions of their future and what is the way out of this crisis. And like I think we're still also trying to work out like what that actually means and like what is our approach. And because also, the free school does a lot of different things, especially with the year of Baldwin. But part of what I feel like is also exciting about, like even like the encampments, is that it's like it's putting a certain question that I think has been like that people have already been feeling on their own, but actually putting a question that's like right there on the table for people to actually deal with. And it's something that one is obviously confronting the students, but is also confronting like basically all the citizens of this country. And this question of like, yeah, will the American people accept, one, the genocide in Gaza being committed in their name, but even more so, like I think Doc will also talk about this, but this question of like, yeah, will the American people accept like World War III being perpetrated in their name by the Biden administration against, like, let's say a country like China? And that is a question that is a democratic question for the American people to resolve. And the question is, can anyone who conceives themselves as a revolutionary in this time, can you basically work towards creating the conditions for the people to actually like come together and address this question as something that belongs to them and doesn't belong to the elites? And so yeah, that's obviously there's a lot there, but these are like the kinds of questions I was trying to deal with, and I don't know if I totally got it right, but I think it's important that we're making the attempt and that we're trying to explore basically stuff that is both urgent and necessary, but also like, yeah, like Baldwin says, like America has not yet been discovered. Like I think he said that in like one of his last speeches in like the late 80s. He's like, America is still an undiscovered country. And it's because in part like the possibilities of what can happen in this country have been so like one, attacked and abused by the ruling class, but also it's like there's still so much to explore. So yeah, I probably should have said that in a more organized way, but But yeah, that's what I was dealing with.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Sherry, and I'm glad you're going before I'm going to speak because it's very helpful. And I think your essay is reclaiming the revolutionary heritage of the American people at a time where intellectuals and even radicals are making the claim that Americans have no revolutionary legacy, and that everything from the 1776 revolution up till now is counter-revolution, and the only revolutionary forces on the planet are outside of the United States, and this is a counter-revolutionary fortress.
Yeah.
And everything in it
Yeah.
is counter-revolutionary. And maybe they'll give Black people a certain nod and say, but they're only 12% of the population, confronted by 88% or 80% who are white supremacists and who will never change. And they will therefore say that the most immediate manifestation of all of this is Trump and the Trump movement. And I think, as you say, you say inductively, I would say, with the historical materiality, the actual, and not the assumptive. And I think this is very, very important because you are absolutely right that the questions that we face are ideological. It is an ideological position to reject the Third American Revolution or the American Revolution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this was such an important and necessary essay, as you say, for the younger generation. And clearly, so much more has to be done. And the fate of the American people and of world peace depends upon how we understand King and this great Third American Revolution. Because if we get that right, and I think we can, by the way, the students might be the last to fully realize it, because, you know, at the level of the Black proletariat, it's very well understood. I mean, if not fully articulated, if people don't have the words for it, they know that something devastating and happened in April 4th, 1968. And the wound is very, very deep among Black people. I was listening to Alice talk about their reading group at South Philadelphia High School, and instinctively 13 and 14-year-olds know that they are better, they are more than what they're being told they are. And that which makes them better and more is their history in this country. And it's such a sad thing to have all of this potentiality at the level of the subject of history, and it constantly being undermined. And this is what we're trying to animate in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is not insignificant in all of this, in large part because of the history of the city in relationship to the Black freedom movement, to the anti-slavery movement, to the Underground Railroad, and up to the present. And that there are families who have been here for all of this time, who maybe migrated in the first great migration from the South, from South Carolina, from Georgia, from Virginia, to Philadelphia, or from Mississippi and Arkansas and Alabama to Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland, and were transformed from an agrarian proletariat to an industrial proletariat. And so much happened. The emancipation of Black women workers. My mother and aunts were not like their mother, who could only work in the houses of rich white suburbanites. But now they work in factories and are members of unions and see themselves differently, you know, than their mothers or aunts did. But all of this happened. Not just my last point I want to make, just like the ascendancy of the Black proletariat into industry, which occurs at the period of the ascendancy of industry and American economic power based upon manufacturing. And this is key to understand, not based upon, in this early period, that is the early part of the 20th century, let us say, not based upon finance, but based upon industry. And so the Black proletariat is organic to all of this, and hence the civil rights movement, properly understood. That's why it has to be called the freedom movement, because it was so organic to the Black proletariat. And that's something we have to return to. But now we're faced with this catastrophe of deindustrialization. And this has been going on for about 35, 40 years, deindustrialization. And, you know, I try to give tours of Philadelphia and to show the ravages of deindustrialization. And this is not just Philly, it's Detroit, it's Cleveland, it's Pittsburgh, it's St. Louis, it's everywhere. And so it renders the entire working class weaker, but the Black proletariat, which is so central, weaker as a subject of history. And then all of these layers of misleadership, which was not always the case. You always had sellouts and Uncle Toms, you know, and all of that type of thing. But you could always kind of rely upon a type of leadership organic to the masses. That's what Montgomery was. Montgomery bus boycott, organic. But now these misleaders, be they the political class, the so-called civil rights Blacks, talk and act as what they really are, servants and apologists for the ruling elite. And they are that. You know what I'm saying? The same thing in labor, in the labor movement. It's really as bad as it is with the Black misleadership class, this labor misleadership class. I mean, in a lot of ways, organizationally, although they're very, very weak, they have more potential organizational power than any other segment of the population. And they constantly misuse it and abuse it and throw it away, so much so that their membership no longer trusts them. But this deindustrialization and how and what is the path to the Fourth American Revolution? And I think by reclaiming the third, you put on the table the possibility of a fourth. And at the same time, you ideologically, although I don't think you engage in a polemic with the, let us say, Gerald Horne's 1619 Project, I think it is abundantly clear that your thesis is the antithesis to what they're saying. I'm sorry.
No, well, yeah, that was a question that I think I thought about, of like how much to like actually engage with like specific people like
I
Horn.
don't think you had to.
And I didn't really want to because yeah, part of it was like on a very basic level. Like I wanted to introduce especially like younger people, but like honestly everyone to yeah, like a different history, like a different like narrative.
And can I say a
Yeah.
different revolutionary chronology?
Yes.
See, this is hugely important,
Yeah.
and this is directly from Du Bois.
Right.
You know, when he says, you know, comparing the Civil War and the freeing of 4 million workers as compared to Europe in the 1848 uprising.
Mm.
And he literally says, and I agree with him on this, that all of the European uprisings, which are great, but were not equivalent to the Civil War.
Yeah.
In the magnitude and numbers of people that were freed, but more than that, even how it pre anticipated
Mm-hmm.
the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movements of the 20th century
Mm-hmm.
and establish the grounding for unity with those revolutionary movements. In other words, Reconstruction, as understood by Du Bois, creates the preconditions for the American working class generally, but the Black proletariat in particular, to unite with the anti-colonial movement. And it's so apparent when Howard Thurman and Sue Bailey Thurman go to India and meet with Gandhi as a part of meeting with the anti-colonial struggle. But the roots are in Reconstruction and the anti-slavery struggle. So I would say yes.
Yeah.
And all of that, all of that is dismissed in the 1619 counter-revolution of 1776 thesis.
Yeah, because I'm also trying to make the argument for what we already, I think, what is part of our like a common assumption in free school, but is essentially, like the centrality of the Black freedom struggle in American history and of the Black proletariat as a historically constituted force that has, in so many ways, shaped the history of the United States. And yeah, I feel like Du Bois obviously captures it in the most comprehensive way, with like how he talks about how, especially like how Black people, the way that they understood emancipation and how they basically also like I was thinking about this question of like religion and like the Black church and stuff and how there's really no like better example of like actual like the dialectical movement of history and of ideas and consciousness than essentially like the story of what Black people did with Christianity. We were able to subvert basically a white supremacist Christianity that's imposed on you, especially as slaves, and to turn it into like a religion of freedom. And to also with the narratives of how Dawkins said, like the people of the book, with the narratives of like Moses and the Exodus, that gives you the courage and the daring to basically engage in what Du Bois calls the general strike. And the other, like also like addressing the Horn, like Gerald Horn thing. I think part of what I wanted to say was that, like someone like Gerald Horn will position Du Bois and Robeson against, like, let's say, a King, where he'll say, oh, King was like a moderate, like basically like an anti-communist, like liberal, and he was only possible because of the McCarthyist, like freeze against people like Du Bois and Robeson, who are more quote unquote radical. Whereas I feel like the way that we view it is actually that King is the best expression of what Du Bois was already trying to work out, and that King also in the civil rights movement was responsible for basically breaking the McCarthyite consensus in American politics. And I think that itself is not fully understood. And yeah, so like those were also questions that I was like trying to tackle.
Oh, good.
What you said about 1968 is not possible without 1960s. It really clicked for me, and it reminded me of something I read before, and I just wanted to read it real quickly. By James Foreman. And from his I think the book Liberation Will Come from a Black Thing.
Mhm.
And he's in Prague speaking to the Viet Cong, like you said, Doc, part of the anti-colonial movement. And he talks about a young man, let me find it real quickly, but he talks about a young man who disavows the civil rights movement. And he basically says that the people of the civil rights movement are crazy and they're nonviolent, and we're not like those people. And what he says is the Viet Cong couldn't believe that he said that, and they think that it's there's nothing crazy about singing spiritual hymn to them.
Mhm.
And he says what that young man didn't realize was he wouldn't be in Prague if it weren't for the people he says the people who sung that Negro spiritual. And I wish I found it. Maybe I'll send it to you, Jeremiah. But I read that a couple years ago, and I always came back to it, and it just speaks to the civilizational force using Negro spirituals, and how sad it was that this man didn't accept this to the civil rights movement, even though they were responsible
Right.
to bringing him to Prague.
Yeah.
I think about that when I think about the students in the encampment. So, like, are they aware of the historical forces at their back that propel them?
Well, yeah. Well, I feel like I'm having a hard time knowing where to start. Like, I feel so constipated because, because actually, and like, I looked at myself in the owl, and like, my brows were so furrowed. And my mom always watches Free School, and she's like, "You need to stop. Like, your face looks so ugly when you do that." But it's because it's like I'm flexing my brain so hard, and it's because like I really admire that you wrote this article, because I completely agree that you're basically getting at all the questions that not only define this moment and possibly like the potential of a fourth American Revolution, which is to say, like us, the people, like being able, like not just young people, but all people being able to further and advance what is the struggle of our time, which is the democratic struggle of our nation. But it's also the questions that I think Free School have to ask explicitly, and we have to think through explicitly, because something like the podcast team, we put a pause on, we were supposed to do an episode on the blues, the uses of the blues, that essay by Baldwin, and we had to put a pause on it because actually a lot of the questions because basically we need more time to even get to certain assumptions that Baldwin already had, to even get to a point where he can write the use of the blues. And actually the assumptions Baldwin had to even get to a point, like Baldwin's here, and I feel like we're back here in some ways, but like in order to get to what Baldwin's actually saying, we have to answer or delineate certain assumptions that are answered by questions that are in here. Because it's basically revolutionary questions. Because to talk about the blues, it's kind of what Samir was saying about civilization, the music as a civilizational force, because essentially what's being asked is like, it is the question of what is revolution in America? And actually, I think your piece plus Nanita's piece are such great compliments, because actually something Nanita said in her article, which also helps frame yours, is she says, it is the American revolutionary process, which is so defined by the Black proletariat, which is perhaps the most advanced revolution not yet completed in the whole world.
Oh,
Yeah, and like, and that's also where nonviolence becomes important, because something that we like tried really hard to begin discussing on the podcast team about the blues is like, it's both about the music, but it's also about where the music comes from and the functions of the music, because the blues, like Baldwin says it, but it's not just a sentence, it's something that has to be examined deeper. He says the blues comes from the sorrow songs, And also, it's not a coincidence that Du Bois concentrates so much on the sorrow songs, because actually Du Bois it's what you said, where Du Bois makes a point where he's like, and like I'm not trying to talk about music, I'm really talking about revolution. But like Du Bois talks about the sorrow songs because he's trying to both define not just a spiritual resource, but also a philosophy or a framework or a way of living, which just means like a capacity to like basically change the world, change the country, do revolution. Where he says it's the sorrow songs that also allow, like you said, for the general strike to happen. And then at the same time, when we were talking about the blues, it does come up where it's like, it's the blues that also passes on something that allows the Black Vanguard, the civil rights movement, to even like create the civil rights movement. And that's also why there's a question today, which is because something else Nandita said in her article, which I think helps also frame how important your article is Nandita like said something like, her article says something basically like that in some ways the difficult thing about no other proletariat in the world has to do what the Black proletariat has to do, which is in America, you have a task where you basically have, in order for America to ever become like the last white nation or free or like basically stop being a bad country or like basically achieve America, you have to, in order to get there, you have to first achieve one people. And that is, and I actually think some of that that's like why it's such an advanced struggle that almost no other proletariat has to do. Like no other proletariat except the Black proletariat has to create one people in order to achieve the country. And then the other thing is, I really like your question about like that you're raising something I think we all assume in free school too much, but we don't question enough, which is like, we raise it, but then we never we inch forward, but it's an immediate question, which is nonviolence. Like nonviolence, not just as a practice, but nonviolence as like a philosophy or like a way, both like a path, but also a way of changing, almost a way of thinking or something. Because because again, like it's because we've been talking about the blues a lot and music, and how that is like, that in some ways is like a very deep thing that's not completely appreciated or understood. But in some ways, I always think about how Ike Miller on April 4th said that the main vehicle that something like love is passed through, like love, not just like family love, like I love you, you love me, but like love as a force is passed through song. And Ike is speaking from, like Ike Miller speaking actually from like basically the perspective of the Black proletariat in the South. And the reason why I think that's significant is because I don't think it's coincidental that it has to be in America, but also by the Black proletariat that basically love, like it is that love and nonviolence that almost somehow, way back to the sorrow songs, it was like expressed. It was expressed in the sorrow song. Like, I don't know, the spirit of like, I know that I live in an unjust society. Like I know something my unjust society will deny, which is I am a human being.
Right.
And if I'm a human being, then I am the creator of civilization. I'm the creator of life. And so this question of how do we become one people? Is that part of it is that the whole people have to get back to that principle. Because actually, it's no such thing as all of us have to go towards white people, because white people are not people. White people are not human. Well, they're human, but they don't have that. They're not people. To become a one people, it has to go towards like that thing of like let's rediscover the very like source of our own potential civilization. And then it just back to like me saying I really admire your article is because what's hard is the reason why I think the podcast team, the blues is so, and also the essay the blues become so deep. And actually, I completely agree with you saying the three important people in free school, which is say the three important people in American history, if we ever want to achieve our nation, is like Du Bois, King, and Baldwin, because there's something, in some ways, the mysterious person is Baldwin. Like, I think people, right? Because people would say like, oh yeah, Du Bois was like really important. He wrote these great books. King was the leader of a movement, but then people are like, oh, Baldwin, question mark. And it's because but actually what in some ways I think Baldwin, we don't completely understand. Like what he really does for us is not completely understood. And like, same, this is me saying also that I think your article gets at a lot of stuff that shows also how complex this moment is for us, because in order to even get to Baldwin, I feel like we have to work through so much shit. And because it's philosophical, it's historical, it's about like the spirit of the people, it's so complex. And then another thing I'm coming to terms with, because we've been talking about the blues so much in music, and how music is not just about music, like what you hear, it's not just even about the structure of the song, but it's actually about a certain source, like a life source, a lifeline. It's about a certain like it's basically something Doc had said was like, in some ways a question, and this goes back to the question of people the question is, can every person in this country see the world the way a Black person does? Like, how do you get there? How can every person, which is to say, can every person in this country see the world the way the Black proletariat or the real proletariat sees? Because in some ways, the reason why Trump supporters become interesting is because they're starting, in some ways, the way they're acting is they're distrusting the ruling elite and the state in ways that the Black proletariat did back to slavery. Like there's something about to be able to understand, but then there's a lot missing. So that's kind of and then but this goes back to like the blues, what we talk a lot about, but we haven't fully understood, which is to say, like, if you're talking to young people, like I think, like even let's say the encampments, like part of the task or the issue is that when we win young people, what we're doing is we're trying to win young people to the Black struggle. Like we're trying to say, like you're not trying to win them to something else. You're trying to win them into their inheritance, which is the whole purpose of your article. But then also the reason why I think the music or the blues or just music or the songs is deep is because if you think about it, like maybe back in the civil rights movement, you could say that the movement comes from church, right? This organizational structure of the church. But actually, like, there is no church like that anymore. So, but what is the essence of the church that remains, that is still remaining, that can still be that revolution can come from, or something can come from? And I think it's song. Because actually, in some ways, like, it would define the Black church's spirit or song. Like, and in some ways, that's the remaining sword or tool today, which is what still remains of the heart of the church, or the essence of the church, is that spirit, that song, that music. And actually, Baldwin would call it language. Like, in some ways, he would call it, in some ways, it's like when we talk about forging a new language, its foundations are from that music or that song. And within that song or language is like, because then you begin to say it's not just about like, oh, all white people need to learn the blues. Like, all white people need to learn how to sing rhythm and blues. It's not just that. It's about seeing. It has to do with, to know the music or to go back to that spirit means to know how to see the world basically as an oppressed person. And that's like, and I take that from the vision statement, like James Baldwin, like that, the Year of Baldwin vision statement, where I think we basically wrote that what we're trying to do is teach, for example, young, like white children to empathize, to basically see themselves as part of the oppressed people, like to see the world as an oppressed people. And I think in America, it's not as simple as being like, we're all workers. Like, it's not like that. Like, I think that's a very common thing I hear, like at my union, for example. Like, you try to convince people, like, oh, all we have to do is convince all these Trump supporters that they're workers. And if you're workers and Black people are workers, then we can all together, like, all say, hey, we're workers, like, fuck the boss. And it's never as simple as that. That's the thing. Because the way people feel is, I'm like, okay, fuck the boss. And when I leave this facility, you would fuck me over. Like, I want to know, do you see me as a human being? You're going to fuck me over. Right. Like, it's not just about my facility. Right. I want to know once we leave the ground with my nurse. You know what I mean? And then like something else that like I feel like was important about reading Jeremiah's article and Nana's article together is like, again, back to the nonviolence love thing, like nonviolence and love as forces or philosophies, like it's philosophy, it's practice, it's a force. But like I almost started thinking about like because I was like drawing arrows, like I always feel like I'm like, this goes to this and that goes to this, but it's like church, what's remaining of the church is like the song, and the song helps forge a new language today, and then within the language is ideology, philosophy, and then even practice, like revolutionary practice. But something like Nanta's in her article that I found like made me think a lot was basically how she quoted King, how basically King put love in dialogue with power. Where basically Nanta was trying to make a point where she was like, the issue with American society is so unjust, right? For many reasons, capitalistic, but also racist, war, this unjust society, and the fact that it's the Black proletariat from the very beginning always knew that this is an unjust society. I always knew 1776 wasn't real. I always knew because come on, like it's an unjust society, and that there's something about like Nandita described it basically as like King was saying that the reason why the only way to make injustice obsolete is to understand that power without love produces injustice. To basically say like that there's something about like in achieving the way Baldwin says we need to achieve our nation where there must be love. Because if we cannot, the American people, first of all, love is the key to even the American people becoming one people. It's the only way that like individuals can live, but it's also there's something about like it must take love, it must take nonviolence in order for America to actually make injustice obsolete in this country. Yeah. And then the one thing I didn't get to because I'm talking kind of long is something you said, Doc, about preconditions, like revolution, like preconditions for like just the thing about preconditions, because how you were like, you were basically like, Black Reconstruction was the precondition to unite at least the Black proletariat and ideally the whole proletariat, the world movement. But yeah, I thought that was kind of deep because I basically think that's in some ways it's the same thing with like the civil rights movement. It's the same thing with the civil rights movement, like where people talk a lot about how King was assassinated because of his stance in the Vietnam War. But really, if you get more specific about it, it's because King was setting he was the key to the precondition of the American people as a whole, the most in history to basically unite with the world movement. And that's very dangerous. That's dangerous for the ruling elite. And then also today, that's why when you were bringing up Jeremiah, that's also why it becomes significant to talk about this stuff today, because you have a lot of young people, especially educated young people in particular, on these college campuses wanting to have solidarity with Palestinians. But it is ultimately a question of what are the preconditions for an American people like uniting with like the world, especially as like China comes in, like, and then we'll go into the Tagore stuff, but like almost 50% of the world, which is China and India's populations, like coming together, then like we're on a cusp of a new epoch. And the real question is whether the American people can become one and do it while become one all while uniting in like not just taking a stand against their ruling elite or even an unjust society or the roots of an unjust society, but also to like join the world. So yeah, and that's all to say that like today I think is very like I think the stakes are very high, which we say a lot, but you do get this feeling of like anxiety or like yeah, these times are very deep. And yeah, and I didn't go into history, but I think history is also really deep because I just got back from Charleston 2 weeks ago, and this goes into the Trump movement, I think, but in Charleston, a city like Charleston, like slavery is everywhere. Like actually poor white people, like South Carolina is a very poor state. Like it's very poor. Like people are very poor. It's not just the Black poor, it's the white poor. People are really poor. And like when you look at poor white people, they are a direct reflection of slavery, I think. Yeah. Like the poverty of white people is a direct reflection of how like the contradiction of slavery caused a problem for America that was never resolved, because all the contradictions of a slave system in the South were just basically redistributed to a northern industry based on like not the right things. Like basically, instead of developing the South into like basically a socialistic agricultural system, instead America as a whole, the economic system is simply just redistributed the contradictions into a new form, which is today what we would call finance capitalism. And so basically all these poor white people in South Carolina, like to me, I was like, it was a direct reflection of, like, it's not just, people always say like, oh, the fact that Black people are so poor shows that there's injustice. And I was like, yeah, but all these poor white people are a direct reflection of the contradiction of slavery too, though. Which is funny because people always think that slavery is to do with Black people, but actually it's to do with white people too. So it's like, yeah, that was also interesting to me. And that also has to do with like our chronology of America, which is like, actually, when we brought the Great Depression, I was like, I really think actually white people are so poor, not because of the Great Depression, it's because of slavery. It's because of like the not resolving slavery. But no one wants to trace the American chronology back to that. Like, yeah. So that was my contribution.
Go ahead, Nancy.
Yeah, well, I wanted to, I also had the same feeling as Emily, like, not sure where to start. But, I was thinking, especially from like this conversation that you were looking at, the things you were highlighting about the essay and the conversation, that the main questions to start with, the main questions we really are trying to deal with is to understand the revolutionary process in America. And that's why the reference point of, like how we cannot afford to be, like trapped in this history of like starting from the Russian Revolution. Instead, we have to really go back to this point and especially go back to Du Bois and how he asked this question and how he develops it. And especially regarding, the question of the conditions for the revolution and the human possibility, and the fact that, like, this is also something that you bring out, which is that you cannot determine the conditions for revolution based solely on the economic conditions. And what we always talk about, the question of sociology. And I was really thinking that this, it was reminding me a lot of Du Bois's formulation of, when he writes Sociology Hesitant, when he talks about the law and chance. What he really gets to is something very basic, that if revolutionary theory is to understand, like basically to address the questions that you're raising, the questions that we're talking about, if revolutionary theory is to ask and answer those questions, it has to see that laws are subject to human action and change. And I think this is something very basic, but at the same time we are, I think, like this is because we are products also of this counter-revolution, where we see laws as the opposite of that. Like we see laws as static, and essentially, like this is the way. I think this is a way to to stop thinking. The moment you think of laws as static and not changing, it's a way to not think. And I think there are examples of this everywhere. I mean, even in science, we see this all the time, because like laws are essentially about how we understand how the world of nature and of human beings work. It's not about the world itself, but about our understanding of it. For instance, I mean, just because like Newton's idea of gravitation was disproved by Einstein, it's not like apples stopped falling, but it was our understanding of it. And I think Du Bois, when he talks about the human action and like what he says, the incalculable, this really is this is what, I think this is why we talk about sociology so much, especially as it pertains to the revolutionary process in America, where you cannot understand the possibilities of revolution and the conditions of revolution, looking at fixed, static laws of economy and so on and so forth. And I was thinking that Baldwin precisely is, yeah, I like how somebody was saying how King is the expression of Du Bois, and I think Baldwin really also is an expression of Du Bois' science, because what he does is, I don't know of any way to make sense of how a Baldwin emerges and how he talks to how we have been thinking about how Baldwin relates to these questions of revolutionary theory, how we think of Baldwin as, I think you said it, Doc, how like Baldwin, like we can think of him as a theorist of crisis. And what he really does is a deep investigation of the self and of society. That's why by being able to understand the human mind, he makes this contribution to revolutionary theory and to uncover the revolutionary possibilities for for our times. And then the question of nonviolence, I think it becomes like I've been thinking about it in a different way because of what you guys are talking about. The nonviolence seems to be the it's a human philosophy because it I think the opposite of nonviolence is anti-thought almost, because what nonviolence as a philosophy is trying to address is the progress of human development, which requires thought, which requires revolutionary theory. And the opposite of nonviolence is basically reaction. And this is something that really comes out of how Baldwin describes it. I remember when I think it's in No Name in the Street, where he talks about this person, when he talks about how nonviolence first became real for him, and he would say that it was not by reading all of Gandhi, or it was not by looking at how people try to apply it or so on, but how he saw in the South that there was this he saw this black man who would live under fear for his entire life, and he saw that at some point this man decided that this is no way to live, that nonviolence actually offers a way for him to live with dignity. And this is why nonviolence became real for him, that it was really a living philosophy. And this is something, it makes all the sense that thinking of nonviolence in this way is so missing from the left today, because left is really trapped in this history which forces it to not think. It forces it to not think about the possibilities today. As long as you're sure that you have the answers to revolutionary theory, you no longer have the need to think and figure it out. Yeah.
Well, just to add to what Shubhart is saying, I think actually there's really no way to make sense of the thought of King or Baldwin except through the framework of Du Boisian science. It's the reason why I say that is because I think they're, for people who want to be oh, Baldwin was a radical because he said these things, but actually what made Baldwin a revolutionary is actually the full totality of his thought. And I'm trying to find the best way to say this, but it's also, I think this is something, definitely a subject for further exploration, and I think some of it will come out in the science event. But part of what Baldwin's whole philosophical movement is the philosophy of the human. And if you also take it in a very concrete way, if we treat nonviolence as basically a total science in some ways, where it's let's say the national students, they had to train, plan, discuss, assess, basically how would they anticipate how the police would respond, how would the business owners respond, how would ordinary white people would respond, how would ordinary black people respond to what they were doing. If you let that sink into your consciousness, all the stuff that they had to actually do in order to reach that place, it's nonviolence as a science is also it is also a direct expression in some ways of Du Boisian science, in the sense that nonviolence category of the scientific method is basically the human being, and that's part of what I think has to be reclaimed for this time, where part of what I think we're trying to also explore is what is a way to actually develop nonviolence in a way that is appropriate for the crisis of American society in this moment. And so I just wanted to agree with what you're saying, where it's we view the framework that we operate within is one Du Boisian science in his category of the human, but also nonviolence as an expression of that as a kind of science.
I wanted to say a little bit about nonviolence because, we're going to talk about India and China later, but I've appreciated how you said that, the way it's usually thought about is like a political strategy, but rather it's a social process. But that also made me think about the civilizational basis of nonviolence in not even just like recent history, but also prehistory of Asia and Africa before the slave trade and colonization, because if you think about how these societies were developing, thousands of years back, I've always been like it's difficult for me to fully process the emphasis that was laid on religion and spirituality as a way of understanding society and the question of the human being, and the way academics will talk about prehistory now, and that emphasis on religion and spirituality is also, oh, this is the absence of modernity, this is the absence of science and rational thought, like superstitious, this and that. But I mean, some of that probably is still true. Like, you can't really go back to that ancient world now because the world has changed. But I don't think the philosophical basis of that searching ever disappeared. And I think you can explain so much on that basis. The rise, the ascendancy of Buddhism, the cultural and philosophical exchanges in South Asia, with Southeast Asia, India, China, all of that. But even questions that have troubled me when I don't understand them fully, like why Gandhi in South Africa is able to basically forge this nonviolent strategy as the way that oppressed people could be free, but also the question of the pilgrimage of Thurman and King to India. I think it's all a proof of principle that philosophical basis has always existed, and it was interrupted with the slave trade and colonization, and then subsequently neo-colonization. But you again see proof that it went nowhere when you look at the sort of songs, as Du Bois talks about it. It stayed alive through a song that came from the people, and then it got translated into the blues, and that helps me understand the civil rights movement and the nonviolent non-cooperation that was like sort of honed into a weapon of struggle as like a revolutionary reimagining, but also a reapplication of that ancient but still present philosophical thrust towards answering that question of the human being. What is the new human being going to look like? And it's a reimagining for modernity. And to not see it as thus is basically doing disservice to the people of this country, but also all over the world, who still have this question to work out because it's not really worked out. But yeah, I don't know if that's
actually, because the whole question on the table is also like Baldwin, like because we're saying Du Bois is science. That's a question too. What do we mean by Du Bois is science? But I know that Baldwin was like, number one, what you don't know about Baldwin is what you don't know about yourself. That's just, and I only say that because I know that Baldwin can or could have been familiar, if not for the interruption, or like the interruption of the counter-revolution that you're speaking about after the civil rights movement, or whatever, how it is that we want to understand that. And I know that Baldwin is representative of a new human being, and more or less, one wouldn't have assumed that this new human being is a Black man, or this new human being looks like Baldwin,
Right.
walks like Baldwin, talks like Baldwin. And I really mean that, meaning like, what is the rhythmic narrative of a people that produces Baldwin? The timing, everything. And actually, that's why I know that what we don't know of Baldwin is what we don't know of ourselves, though Baldwin can bring it out. what Baldwin brings out is ultimately something very, very genuine about who we are, who I am. I only know that as a fact because I've read him and I put him in my life. I put him in myself. I related to him. I thought about it. And I actually figured that all the people that he wrote about, fictional or non-fictional, were me. And I feel like that's been also our experience in reading James Baldwin, whether that be in the Monday reading group internally with people in free school or in the Thursday reading group in the public library. It is how you relate to Baldwin that also decides something about how you relate to the future, or where exactly it is that your revolutionary essence, or if you can see that there's a revolutionary essence already inside of you. And the problem is, or one of the problems that you already mentioned, Emily, is this, the young people who do not see themselves in Baldwin, and I think that Baldwin is something that King also was driving to. Like, I think there's something in King that is very reminiscent of what Baldwin became, but King died. Like, King still didn't have that time to become like, and I'm speaking about because we asked the question of the philosophical as the social, the living, the thing that is like, because explaining philosophy becomes an intellectual project if you're not concerned about society or not concerned about people. But what is the point of philosophy besides discovering yourself, discovering the human being, discovering something that is also new, or whatever you want to put it? And that that change of narrative or that change of framework also happens in a social and historical context. Who is the philosophical base? What is the philosophical based upon? If it is based upon a denial of a human being, then you also work on pretty much anything, whether that be in the arts, sciences, like literally the framing of it all would be accustomed to a society, whether that is a capitalistic society or whether that is an anti-human society, or, because the actual striving of the philosophy, the striving of the framework also describes, what the philosophy is trying to do. And that's also what we're saying by or what you have pointed out with love as partnered with power, or the complications that come with how, what you said, Jeremiah, about you wanted to understand the dialectical quality. Well, what is dialectics? You know what I mean? Are we talking about motion? Are we talking about, me and Doc were talking a little bit about, the threes, like the trialectics and things like that. So it's also coming into question about what actually is the basis of what moves, either that be time or people or thought. And so I'm thinking basically that we're talking about the nature of a new human being that has been emerged, but a counter-revolution that attacked the human being, which attacked the music. It attacked the song. Or at least I was talking to Doc about how because Doc had also mentioned the threes that you had said: the church, the family, and the song. And
Right.
Yeah, the remnants of it all depend upon how we believe in the music. Like Donny Hathaway's song, I believe in music. I believe, let me pull up those lyrics, seriously. Because he's talking, wait. This is kind of random, sorry. Okay, he's saying, I believe in music, I believe in love. So music is love. He's saying that I believe. And when you said, actually, I'm really thinking about the panel that we had on Saturday about in the April 6th event, and how we had talked about consciousness and where that whole thing about the whole reason why God is important is if you have a way to understand, we're saying, where you are from, you had mentioned or you were mentioning the trajectory. You have to understand the civilizational characters, you have to go back but where are we going back to? And we have to go back to Reconstruction because we have to go back to slavery because that is where that's what we're struggling against, right? But then God is important because the prophetic describes the future. The prophetic describes where we want to be at. And okay, I'm gonna bring up another song, sorry. Because I've been obsessed with this LaBelle song, Phoenix. And I literally sent this song to like 70 people on like Wednesday because I was like, people need to hear this because it's so revolutionary. And in the chorus it was saying, so in the chorus it says, we've all got to, okay, sorry. The only reason why I'm missing this music, not to be like weird or anything like that, I'm not trying to take away from the discussion, but it is odd because we never discussed music like this before. Anyway, the chorus is, we've all got to go like we've come. Like we all are born and we all die. Like whether that be in anguish or whether that be in a ripping, you know, like imagine a birth, like you, and then imagine a death. We all got to go like we've come. And you know, before or after the sun. And then there's this part. And if you believe in the one, which is like God, which is like the truth, which is like, you know, you'd be living the one life God's given. And I really needed to hear that because I feel like I'm trying to make sense of my life like so much. And it makes me feel like I can because another song came in my head. You walk in faith. Like you walk in knowing something about what I'm saying is that in knowing something about yourself, you know something about your steps, the things that you have done also describe who you are. And that's important to know who you are. And so why that line was really important to me is because I literally came to free school by like happenstance. And many people came to free school not knowing what it was about or why we even wanted to come here, but it protected us. And I've been reflecting about that a lot because I think what the missing piece in a lot of our generation is not listening to that voice that is guiding us, not listening to that intuition that we feel is kind of like giving us answers for like our real potential, our real role in the world.
Can I say one last thing? Well, yeah, I really like what you guys are saying because it also, I feel like I'm still also even trying to make sense of the questions that I was trying to address in the essay, but part of it is that, yeah, I think it's like sometimes people will wonder or ask like, oh yeah, like why are you guys so into like yeah, Baldwin or like you boys, like why are you guys so into the civil rights movement? Especially if it's not, you know, like if your background, you know, like being like an Asian person, for instance, or like, oh, like why don't you just stick to like Asian things, I guess. But part of it is like, yeah, I mean, this is just like affirming what you guys are saying. But part of it is that, like, to the extent, like Serafina said, to the extent that you don't know Baldwin or you don't know the civil rights movement or you don't know the music of basically the Black proletariat, is the extent to which you don't know yourself. And I think we have, through happenstance and through some, I guess, like cosmic luck, I guess we've all been able to come together and like discover that together. At least like I feel like I've been able to discover that as a result of all this. But I think, yeah, like I think there's a tendency, which I feel like I see amongst just like online leftists, to either, yeah, wholesale reject this question of America and to be like, yeah, like I reject everything about America. It's all counter-revolutionary. There's no hope here. Or if your thing is like, oh, like we want to have an American revolution, you have this whole thing of like American flags and like American workers who are like masculine, and like it's also trying to just basically mimic like the Soviet thing. But it's like you're dealing with an America that's abstract. you're dealing with an abstract idea of America. And it's like we're trying to deal with a concrete America, which is basically the America that has been produced by the Black proletariat. And like no matter like where you live in this country, it's like, yeah, the extent to which people don't know the blues is, yeah, obviously like the extent to which people don't know themselves. Like no matter what your background is. And I think like we're trying to make that case. And it's not something that comes from thin air, but like as you were saying, like we're dealing with like the actual historical materiality of like what has made up this country. And it's not something that you can just do by like doing like an AI generated thing of like, what would a socialist revolution in the United States look like? And just like generate like AI images. Like it's not like that is the most abstract idea of what the American revolutionary process would look like. And we're trying to deal with it in concrete. And yeah, I just agree. It's like the extent to which like people don't know Baldwin is the extent to which people don't know themselves.
This conversation is making me think about a lot. I think also what we don't know about Baldwin and Black people in this country is also what we don't know about America.
Mhm.
And I think I'll try to make it come back to this point, but what everyone is talking about is also actually making me think about like what nonviolence actually means. Like what is the use of nonviolence as well?
Mhm.
Because I think objectively what it's trying to get at is saying that actually ideas matter.
Mhm.
Ideas in the sense that ideas transform people and transform society. And because the nonviolence is to violence. I think it's a response to violence that is so pervasive in society, and feeling that it's violence that will bring about transformation of society. And it's establishing that change doesn't oftentimes occur in huge bursts, but actually like in something like the civil rights movement, it also took time for people to change, for people to grow. And to develop a new form of like a new human being, what Emily was saying earlier about too, which is how do you transform human beings in which you see yourself as part of the oppressed? Because I think when we're talking about Black, whites here as well, is that when you choose to become white, it means that you choose to not see certain things about American society, to choose to ignore the fact that this is an unjust society. But it's something that Black people in this country have historically not been able to escape. Not been able to escape the fact that this is an unjust society and they live in one. And therefore I've had to also transform the society as well to make it become what it claims to be. And even this thing of like, I think what's so important about the article, but also something that's so profound is that King, this is a tangent, but King always looked to Jeremiah in the Bible. And maybe you know.
Many places.
But Jeremiah was an example. Maybe you know more, or you and Doc know more about this, but Jeremiah as a martyr in the Bible, where King also knew that in opposing society, he would, like, the laws would predict his death.
Damn.
Right, yeah.
And yeah, it was like something that Michelle said like 2 weeks ago, where King like realized that actually the natural law is that he would die because of the stances he took. Just as the way that Jeremiah in the Bible was a martyr because he had, maybe you know more about this. But anyways, tangent. But I think what's important is also like this question of like, what is democracy and what is possibility? And where does possibility come from? Because what Du Bois, King, Baldwin all share is that the possibility that they see is in individual human beings. Like, what are ordinary people thinking about? Like, what does oppression actually mean in their lives? Like, what does it mean to live a moral life in spite of the oppression that they face in their lives? And that's why I think James Baldwin is especially his novels, you get a sense of him like talking about love and life and loss and like what it means to be human in an unjust society. And the reason why I say that is also connected to what you were saying earlier, which is another thing Baldwin says, is that America's still undiscovered. It's an undiscovered, unexplored country. And I think that's what, I guess, I don't know how much we should talk about the left, because sometimes I just think it's irrelevant, but where it's like, there's an assumption that you already know what the possibility is, or there's an assumption that you know who the American people are, or what they're already thinking, or what they're even capable of.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like, that's a democracy where you can only, like Baldwin was saying how, you know, I can't change society. Like he said it not in a nihilistic way. Baldwin said, I can't change society. What I can change is the moral capacity of people to change society. Because it's not just going to be one individual, but actually what it is that for us to study King, for us to study Baldwin, is to elevate the capacity, like the heart and the minds of people to feel that they are part of changing the society. And this has become really real because, and this is also true of the different reading groups, which is that for the year of Baldwin, it's an exploration of Baldwin, but it's also an exploration of the American people. Like, who are the American people? Like, what are they thinking about? And I think that's why we go to all these different reading, like different locations throughout the city to try to meet people, to try to engage people in the ideas of Baldwin. And like one example has been South Philly High School, where you like, it's a specific instance, which is South Philly High School. You can see statistics of South Philly, or the public school system. Yes, like the Philly's public school system is known to be shitty, terrible, like low literacy rates. And then especially for South Philadelphia High School, like literacy rates, terrible. Like, but the thing is, what does it actually mean? Like, how do the students who go through a system like that think? And it's been so eye-opening for me too, because they've become my children, where the white thing is to think, oh shit, like this school system sucks. And I'm gonna, like, power to me means that I'm gonna create the means so that my children don't have to attend South Philadelphia High School. But actually, like, what a true revolutionary means is that you create a society in which no South Philadelphia High School exists. Because in meeting these students, I'm like, holy fuck. But yeah, meeting these students, it's like they know they're handed terrible cards. They know that they are handed a terrible education, that teachers, like many teachers, some don't care and some don't have the means to do it. Like, who's teaching these teachers? And then they also know that they're not given great food at school. And they know that they're not given transportation to school. They're being told all these things. And so, like, in this, I'm like, none of our children in this country should have to go through something like that. I think that's, and I'm trying to make sense of this experience because it was also new too, but connecting it to Baldwin and connecting it to King, which is that, like, what is possible of this country is buried within the people of this country.
Right.
And actually, in meeting these children, I'm like, there's such a potential in the American people, because it's 3 kids, right? And according to many standards, like 3 is not a lot. But actually, these 3 have shown me, like, what's possible in this country. Because despite everything that they face in the school system, despite everything they face in their families, there's something about them that is so kind and wants to be good. And that's the democracy, which is, what are they going to choose to make of their lives? What are they going to choose to make of the society? And that's what Baldwin and Du Bois and King are saying, which is that the people themselves will decide the questions of poverty and war and all of this of our country, and to build a new nation. But I don't know much about the blues, and that's also probably what Baldwin says, which is like, I don't know much about music, I don't know much about art, but I know something about love. And he said this also specifically about one of his closest friends, Buford Delaney, which is that I don't know much about art, but something about Beautiful Delaney is that I know that he knew something about love.
Mm.
And in his paintings, he showed something about love.
Mm.
And that's why I think, like, it is odd. I think certainly many of us come from like a university education, and love is like, oh, what's love? But then I think you ask ordinary people and they're like, yeah, love is what gets you up in the morning. And like, and even with these children, they might not say love, but they say my grandma said this, or my mother said this. And they might not say that that's what keeps them up, but they're always referencing them. And what is it that's going to change the society if not that? But I think I'm trying to make sense of a lot of things. And what this is also showing is that there's so many questions that people will have to decide for themselves too. The way in which a strong, like you were saying, Doc, earlier on, like ordinary people are very much weakened right now. But is there a way in which morality and the human is able to bring about something that economic conditions in the 60s were able to facilitate? Because I don't know how much we can do about creating industry in this country, but I know that at least, or what we do believe is that there's something about moral capacity that can bring about change.
You want to move on to the next section?
Should we? Okay, well, this is such a moving discussion, as it should be, because we're really talking about the subject of history,
Right.
the human being. And once you talk about human beings, we're talking about ourselves, and it brings forward all kinds of feelings and all kinds of emotions. And of course, when you have a Baldwin who explained and articulated and investigated the human in all of their complexity, and not just an abstract human being, but the human being produced by the American history. It's a powerful instrument for sociological analysis and for understanding the trajectory of history, the logic of history, if you will. But I just wanted to contribute to this discussion by talking about what we might call science, ideology, and the tactical demands and imperatives of this time. By tactical, I mean the revolutionary political demands of this moment. As King and Diane Nash and James Lawson and so many hundreds of other people who constituted themselves as the vanguard of the American people. And I agree with you completely, Jeremiah. They saw themselves as part of a world movement. They always said it that way. And in fact, when the civil rights movement had to move to a new stage, and this is little known, unfortunately, that the entire vanguard of that movement joined with the World Peace Council, Roma Chandra, with the movement against neo-colonialism as the next stage of their own struggle. There's so much we have to learn, and so much that not just the younger generation, but America, period, has to learn about its own history. And so questions immediately arise in this period of protest, and we're witnessing the emergence of a great moment of protest. I can kind of recognize it because I went through something like this. This might be new for you all, but this moment is more profound than that moment was. However, the legacy that we claim as our own, and that's why I understand parenthetically, that's why I understand very clearly how whether one is Asian or Latino or African American, at the end of the day, we are all Black based upon the legacy that we identify ourselves with. We are all Black. And I think what Baldwin is saying in many ways is that to be free, you literally have to be Black. And by Black, he is talking not just about a racial or ethnic type, but about a historically constituted people whose music must become the American song. There's no other way to do it. Whose poetry, whose art, whose morality must be the American morality, the American song. Just one thing on song, because I've been talking to a lot of people, several people about this. And all that we do, when Alice talks about South Philadelphia High School, or when Emily talks about her time at the polls and the ladies that she was with, I consider all of this to be indispensable sociology. And without sociology, which is, I think, the more foundational science of the social sciences. Without sociology, you can't know the people that you need to know and how they feel and how they think. And like when I listen to Alice talk about those 3 students and Brandon Doe and his mentoring of them and their trip to the Philadelphia Museum of Art to look at Buford Delaney's painting of Baldwin. I mean, that is such an important experience for young people 13 and 15 years old. And that experience and the pedagogy that you all have adopted in that classroom can perhaps make of them the new human being that we need to assume the vanguard in this great final struggle, perhaps, for the freedom of humanity. And it would seem ironic, and of course, contrary to the left, in saying that the center of that struggle might be here, and not just because this is the hegemonic power, the most dangerous nation, but because of the American people and our legacy. We have the preconditions to do what no other people can do. I really think we do. Now, in saying that, it is not inevitable. It is not inevitable. And we have to fight really hard for this. Very, very hard. And it is going to be a hard fight. And, we have our own limitations. We're growing as we struggle. And so Are we on the cusp of a fundamental turning point in US history? Are we on the cusp of a fourth American Revolution, of a new democracy? And for many, democracy is not a good word, and they counterpose socialism to democracy. Democracy is the language of the liberal bourgeoisie, and socialism is the language of revolutionaries. Nothing could be further from the truth, because what we are talking about finally is the power of the people. A new democracy. Are we on the cusp of a new people's power, achieved in the name of the people? Are we at the starting point of peace, a nation dedicated to peace, and hence a peace industrial economy? Are we along with humanity on the cusp of a new epoch? And can that epoch be realized only if the American people achieve their nation and become the last white nation? Antonio Gramsci, as we've said so many times, said, the old is dying and the new cannot yet be born. And then he continues, in such a situation, monstrosities are produced. And frankly, that's what we talked about last week. Forgive me for cursing so much. I didn't really mean to, but I couldn't help myself. One of the monstrosities, one would say one of the great ironies of history, is in the name of the Jewish people, a Nazi genocidist regime, an ideology has taken hold in Western Asia, in Israel. You know, it is an irony. For example, in the 1930s, Du Bois, who had studied in the 1890s in Germany, could not believe that the German people would follow Hitler. Couldn't believe it. So he went to Germany because he valued Germany, he valued the philosophy of Germany, the history of Germans. But indeed, this very civilized and sophisticated nation had in fact betrayed itself and gone over to Nazism. When you think about the contributions of Jewish thinkers to European civilization and to the Enlightenment, such names as Spinoza and Einstein and Marx and Freud, and of course, we could go on and on. How could a people who produce this also produce a Nazi regime and a Nazi ideology? And how is it? And this is, you know, part of the frustration and the anger of how could this people, 80% of whom in Israel support the genocide against the Palestinians and do not resist their being wiped out? Or how, even with Jewish Voices for Peace and Not in My Name and the student movement, how is it that the majority of people who ethnically identify themselves as Jewish in the United States could support that? You know, you ask the question, well, what happened? I think it is not beyond the human, where a group of people become that which attempted to destroy them. They are the modern day Nazis. And what separates them from the Nazis of the 1930s and 40s is that they tried to keep secret what was going on in the death camps. This group of Nazis in Israel are quite proud of openly, before humanity, carrying out a genocide. This is the monstrosity that Gramsci talked about. And perhaps it is a condition of the transition from the old to the new. But the new is being born. In the United States, we're living through what we've talked about many times, a crisis of legitimacy, but in fact, a special or unique crisis of legitimacy. I would argue an irreversible crisis of legitimacy. America will never be what it was before this crisis. So the question is, how will the crisis be resolved? Because it cannot be resolved by going back to what was, i.e., make America great again. That's delusional. And it's quite interesting that such a proposition could only emerge from a population, the white population, that has never come to terms with this nation. And in fact, as you said, Jerry, or somebody, or Emily, with the Black freedom movement. Because in a certain sense, they don't know how to make America great again, or to make America great. They just don't know. But this crisis of legitimacy could lead to what is called regime or systemic collapse. Now, in that situation, we will need Baldwin and King and the Black movement, and by the way, Black song, the blues, more than we ever have. In a condition of systemic collapse, or regime collapse, or something close to that, it is only the spiritual and moral resources of the people who can save the people.
Wow.
In such a collapse, there's always the option of violence, of brother fighting brother, sister fighting sister. That's what such collapse usually leads to. Now, I'm not saying collapse is inevitable. And I know we in the free school wish to avoid that in the struggle for democracy. But if it occurs, then what do the people have to fall back upon? You know? And I think it is absolutely clear that the vision of the Black proletariat is the only vision that can save the nation from fratricide and from a civil war which would lead to the destruction of all classes and groups in society. You know, people will avoid the truths of Du Bois, King, and Baldwin until they can't avoid it anymore. And by people, I'm talking about those activists, and just parenthetically, a lot of people are turned off by the activists because they're too arrogant. They don't know how to talk to people. And people don't want to be preached to. Because to start with, most people don't have a lot of trust in activists because they don't know where they came from. Don't come here to Philadelphia and go to Temple or Penn and suddenly you're going to lead the masses here. It's not what happens that way. But the truths that these people and thinkers have brought will be denied until they can't be denied any longer. Certainly, part of the problem is the failure of the ideological, philosophical, and logical approaches that most young people have learned in universities. And here, when we talk about activists, we're talking about disproportionately activists who come from universities. No problem with that. But they come with good hearts, but the intellect and the ideological, philosophical dimensions of bringing about social change are very weak. In other words, they would prefer Judith Butler to James Baldwin, or Noam Chomsky to Martin Luther King, or Du Bois for that matter. However, this failure is rooted in the limitations of the European Enlightenment itself. To think logically in twos, dyads, binaries, and not be able to logically think, well, as Du Bois suggests in Black Reconstruction, in threes, dialectics through threes, trialectics, and even more complex social realities. If the American people are to become the subjects of their own freedom, it will require a return to these ideological foundations that we talk about. The ideological struggle is paramount at this time. We know, and we see it every day, the American people will act if they know. But the people must know. And it's not spontaneously developed. You know, they must know. Now, that group, which is most advanced, and this is historically verified, the most advanced group is the Black community, the Black proletariat, the most advanced. In fact, even when it is not spoken, they understand much of what we are saying and hear what we are saying and agree with it without a lot of talk, without a lot of reading and so on. Mm-hmm. We see it all the time. The student movement, which is a great movement of resistance, but it is students. But it is a great movement. It is more significant than the student movement of the 60s against the war in Vietnam. It is not more significant than those students that were involved in the Southern movement. By the way, the majority of students in the Southern movement were from historically Black colleges. Even back then, the majority of students in the anti-war movement were from historically white colleges, like Columbia, like Harvard, and so on. So there was already two student movements. At this point, the Black colleges have not given us that type of student activist like a Diane Nash or John Lewis or all of these students who didn't go South, who already in the South, you know. But this student movement will be a trigger. And their numbers will expand, they will get larger. And the more that the university administrations attack them, the more they're going to fight back and find creative ways of challenging them. And certainly they will be in Chicago at the Democratic Convention. Now, a big test for Black colleges will be when Biden goes to Morehouse College in Atlanta to give the commencement speech. We'll have to see what the students there do, what the Morehouse students, what the students in that Atlanta University complex of historically Black colleges, what they do. It'll be a test for them. Not students who come from outside or activists who come from outside, but what they do. We'll see. The preconditions of a great movement for democracy of Fourth American Revolution, and pretty much what we here in the Free School do all the time, is to develop and think through and impart what are the preconditions for this next stage of struggle. Because, you know, like we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement, with other movements in this time, they have huge marches, but then suddenly they disappear. You know, Black people still getting killed by the police, so where's Black Lives Matter? You know, but was it about Black life or about a kind of virtue signaling about a certain self-identification? But our claims, which we can never retreat from putting forward, is that part of the American population which can sustain a great movement are Black folk. And we have to find more ways to say this to more people and more parts of the American population. Which means, and this is why I think you're right. I mean, I know, like you said, I don't feel like talking about the left. I don't really like those people. I don't, you know, and I feel you. And I don't like their arrogance. I don't like their obstructionism. And if there's any, they are obstructing the move forward. Let me give you an example. I don't think there's any way to claim fidelity and unity with the working class as a whole and its interests and embrace Joe Biden. You know, yes, UAW, you organized that Volkswagen plant in Tennessee. Beautiful thing. I congratulate you. But then, you know, you support Biden. You can reject Biden on the question of war and peace and say, like the Arab community in Michigan, abandon Biden. That doesn't mean you are out and out a supporter of Trump. Like I read recently a labor leader, or someone involved in your union whom I won't name. I'll tell you later. Who wrote on Facebook because it was a debate about the Pennsylvania primaries and voting non-committed, which is a vote against Biden on the question, pretty much of Palestine and Gaza and so on. And several of the people said, well, I'm going to vote non-committed, but in the general election, I'll have to vote for Biden to keep Trump out. You see what I'm saying? And then this one person, who I think identifies himself as a leftist, in trying to navigate that debate and not being seen as weakening or threatening Biden's possibility of being elected, because all labor unions, we have to support Biden, at least the leaders of them. You know, he said, well, at the end of the day, Hamas and Likud are two sides of the same coin. Now, this is why I'm so happy I'm fine. If you never cursed in your life, that hypocrisy, that moral cowardice is, I mean, how do you get your head around it? Likud and its coalition partners in the Israeli government are Nazis, are genocidists, are dropping 2,000-pound bombs on hospitals and schools and killing children and mothers and babies. Oh, they're the same? Which is his way of giving himself a political, and I guess he would say moral out to support Biden. It is becoming clear, and I think the student movement, I think the Arab movement, I think the 1,000 Black ministers, I think the AME Church, and all of this are saying in one or another way, and I think increasingly so, we can't support this genocide, nor can we support the Biden administration's push to world war, either with Iran or now with China. Do we get a fundamental choice if Biden is defeated? No, we don't. But we defeat the spearhead of the move towards a world war. Must be done. There cannot be apology for this regime. Just can't do it. War is the enemy of the poor, and the poor recognize it. The poor recognize it. What was adding fuel to not passing this bill, this funding of Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan? Well, the anti-interventionist wing of the Republican Party. But what are the districts that they're from? They're from the poor, white, working class districts, where they were saying to Marjorie Taylor Greene, girlfriend, we don't want war spending where you can't provide for us. So how do trade union leaders, have they rejected the struggle to unite with the poor? Are they only concerned about their members, which is a very small part of the entire working people? And I mean, how do you do it? How do you get your head around it? You know, Sean Frank, how do you get your head around this? How do you look at yourself in the mirror? Now to the Blackness leadership class. One thing is perfectly clear. They're fighting for their lives. Because Biden goes down, they go down. And frankly, nothing would make me happier. Because their role is as a managerial class. device to manage Black people, to mislead Black people and such. But nonviolent resistance, emphasis on both words, nonviolence and resistance. Or I could put a third word, nonviolent active resistance. This is not pacifism. Cornel West, you got it wrong. You don't understand King. Frankly, or Du Bois for that matter. It is an active enterprise. However, to win people to this means you have to win them to a strategy and tactic of activism. In other words, for revolutionaries to win people to a non-violent active resistance to a regime of war and austerity and repression, to win them is the hallmark. That's what Diane Nash, that's what Jim Lawson, that's what King and them were all, to win the American people. I think that our strategy is the right one. And the students need our message, already far, quote, ultra-leftist, so-called revolutionaries are infiltrating all of the student movements. If history is prologue, if history tells us anything from the past, the ultra-left is a vehicle through which agent provocateurs come into movements. And so students who are vulnerable, who are young, who are naive, are easily misled. And at the end of the day, the movement, which is powerful, won't exist. Let me just give my last example. Students for Democratic Society in the early 60s was a great student movement, and pro-civil rights, anti-war. Leftists, ultra-leftists, including LaRoucheites, Lyndon LaRouche himself, went into SDS because they weren't going to get into no SCLC. I can tell you that right now. They weren't going to, they would get hurt if they tried to infiltrate a Black church. I can tell you that. But here you had all of these, great young people, overwhelmingly, I don't even know if there was a Black person in SDS. They went in and split SDS. When you hear, have you ever heard of the Weathermen? The Weathermen were a part, they were these leftists that went into SDS and created a faction and said that SDS was a liberal organization that had to become revolutionary. What did LaRouche call his organization? It's called, in the beginning, National Caucus of Labor Committees. Well, what were their labor committees in? In the SDS. They were the so-called labor committees of the SDS. I know a lot of people have a lot of, when they talk about Bill Ayers, when they talk about the Weather Underground and all that shit, a lot of people have romantic. No, they acted as agent provocateurs within SDS. And by the way, none of them did no big time, even though they were involved in some really kind of terrorist activity. Some of them, of course, Bill Ayers' wife, Bernadine Dorn, I think her name was or is, became a professor, full professor of law at Northwestern University. But they did such great damage. It was in 1968 at the Democratic Party convention and at Columbia where these same forces disrupted the demonstrations against the Democratic Party. Very different from what happened in 1964 in Atlantic City when the civil rights activists sat in and protested, in a different way. But LaRouche, that's why I say, don't tell me what you are now or what you claim to be now. I want to know your whole history. I want to know that history. What was the National Caucus of Labor Committees? Okay? What was the anti-communist, anti-black attacks that y'all were part of? And I can tell you about that because I was part of the people that was attacked. And I'm trying to find out where they found them black people coming with them nunchucks, given that your organization is white. Yeah. But I mean, we dealt with it, as I've told y'all before. We took the nunchucks and spanked that behind. But yeah, but that's what they was doing. So now you're gonna tell me, well, Lyndon LaRouche ran for president 8 times. 8 times? What you doing? And we got an idea of how to reform the world economy, and the Queen of England is the source. Come on, money. But the thing is a distraction from the main path. And again, and the subject of history, the human factor. Don't come to me about with no technological determinism that if you manipulate this and put another bank here and reroute world finances in a certain way, all that old technical shit now, and all that nickel and dime espionage, to make yourself sound sophisticated.
Yeah.
When the real consciousness is among those kids in South Philly, those ladies at the polling place. When Emily started playing this music, that R&B, you understand? Woman said, come here. She said, come here, honey. They said, are you black? Are you mixed? I mean, that's the way black people talk. Well, she said, no, I'm full-blooded Chinese. They asked her because they were asking, how do you know our language? How do you know our soul, our heart? And she said, well, my friend introduced me to this. And the lady said to her, I want to kiss your friend. But you understand what I'm saying? The human factor. And that's what I'll end on. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, the one thing related to that story, the one thing I wanted to add is, like,
can I just say one thing? Just for black people, so you know, music, and that's what we're doing with the function of the blues, uses of the blues. The church, the family, and the music. That music sustains us. It really does. It is our narrative, it is our song, it is our poetry, it is our hope. It is not, music for us is not what it is for white America. But if our music becomes the music of white people, the white poor, they will be a different people. It has sustained us through the worst of times. That's why whenever you see these churches, you go into these churches and they have these huge choirs and all that singing. I mean, we are rejuvenated by it.
Yeah.
The white man has taken damn near everything he could take from us. everything. Transatlantic slavery, we didn't have our language no more. We had to, all of that. But one thing they haven't been able to take from us is our music.
Mm.
They haven't been able to, and we ain't gonna give it up.
Mm.
Now they can bring hip hop and gangster rap and all that talk, all that bullshit, but our default position is on music.
Mm.
It is our fight for our humanity, and it is an ideological force. And when you say the fight for the our humanity, why do we have to fight? Against whom are we fighting for our humanity? And every Black person, and when Emily told me this story, I could visualize it. I could visualize these ladies. I could visualize how for those 7 or 8 hours, they took Emily as their daughter, as their sister, as their friend. You feel our music. It's the most precious thing to us. And that's it. Sorry.
No. Well, because something when we're talking about, and then maybe Mary talk about encampments, but something I always ask is the Palestinian solidarity movement, whether you want to call, or let's just call it the student movement today. My big question is, I'm like, why are you so trusting of white people? And I don't mean just skin color. You know what I'm saying? Because there is this question, which is like the way you said it, I know it was funny, but it's also true, which is there's a reason why LaRouche never went into a Black church. It's not just because he was scared of Black people, but it's because you know that Black people sniff out shit. You know what I mean? But that's a lesson for people in general. That's a lesson of how do you sniff out fake shit. And because it is something I thought about when I was basically Tuesday, it's actually really fucked up because it's illegal, but my union gives us election days off, primary general election days off as a holiday, so that we're mandatorily required to volunteer for. It's a way to avoid labor violations. But so then I have to work 8 and a half, 9 hours at the polls, where I'm doing last minute flying and stuff. But the only competitive race in the whole city was in a very deep Black neighborhood. Actually, I don't think I've actually been to a neighborhood like that, where it's north of Market Street. I don't know what that huge spot is called. It was technically parts of Cobb's Creek up north above Market Street. And it's not Carlton Village, it's the Black part. And that area is still because West Philly is very gentrified, even to the 60th Street. It's very gentrified. You can feel it, and that the streets are less clean. The number one sign of gentrification is the vanguard of gentrification is when the streets are not as clean. Because it means people aren't we've lost community structure so that people don't take care of, there's more trash and stuff. There's still community structure in this area. And I was actually it felt really weird to me because I was this is so close to where I live in West Philly, but it's the Black community. And you're the one who told me that a lot of people in North Philly move out there because it's still untouched. And I was assigned to a pole named after Richard Allen's wife, Sarah Allen. It's called Sarah Allen housing something. But yeah, it's Black. Those houses are still really beautiful because people still have their houses, and everyone still knows each other. Because I was doing a really bad job, campaigning for this person I was supposed to be campaigning for, because the other two campaigns had volunteers who were actually from the community, so they all knew each other. And so I was the odd one out, not just because I wasn't Black, but because everyone was come on, baby, come get this literature from me. And I was I can't do that. I can't do that. I can go over here. So, but I didn't know what to do. At first it was awkward because basically what I'm trying to say is that a real Black community, I could sense that they were distrusting of me with very good reason. And in some ways it was a positive sign because that distrust is a protection mechanism. After being betrayed by so many people, including the Blackness leadership class. And so at first it was kind of awkward. And then when I started playing this music, like I got my speaker because actually the campaign has suggested that I play music. And I was like, oh, okay, great, because it'll be, I don't know what music that I would play, like Dolly Parton maybe. But I was like playing like the stuff the free school we listened to, rhythm and blues. Like I was just playing our whole playlist of everything we listened to. Like, and I'm like, it's very hard to DJ for 8 hours. Like it was actually really hard. I had to pull up everything that we had listened to, like everything I could think of. And immediately when I started playing music, it changed the vibe. It broke a certain tension because, people, that's the music, like that's what music does. It's like that kind of language. And then eventually after a few hours of playing the music, this volunteer, and then later I like befriended the volunteer from the Black Ball campaign named Soprano. And she was like, oh, I haven't heard this song in so long. That was the first song I played. And then after the third song, she was like, I still haven't heard this song in so long. But, for her, it was like the LaBelle that really got her. She was like, Isn't It a Shame? After I played Isn't It a Shame by LaBelle, she let out this deep sigh because she had sung every word to the whole song. She let out a deep sigh. And she was like, yeah, that hits hard. Like, it's a language. But the thing that it showed me was my white coworker later came by, and like, it's funny because when you're just with when my coworkers are just with each other, you basically realize that is a silo. Like they really don't know what the real Black community is thinking. Most people don't know what actually Black people are thinking because they're also purposely protecting themselves. Like they don't want you to and they won't openly tell you. They don't want you to know. And I talked to Soprano, and she was like, yeah, I actually registered my whole neighborhood to vote as part. She was paid by the hour by her campaign. And she was like, interestingly, a lot of people are registering to vote from this neighborhood. She's like, they're switching parties. And she didn't tell me which parties, but I could guess, right? So I asked her, I was like, you mean Democrats and Republican, right? And she's like, yeah. Most of this neighborhood, she's like, it's very interesting. They're switching their registrations from Democratic to Republican. And she was like, yeah, I found that so fascinating. But of course she didn't tell me she thought it was good or bad because she's still sussing me out. She was just like, it's interesting, isn't it? Because she's trying to suss me out first. And I was like, yeah, it is. But just this thing of there's something about the music where people would use different words with me, but this Vietnam War vet, this older Black gentleman who's going to vote, he was like, oh, who's playing this music? Who's playing this music? And everyone's like, oh, that Chinese girl's playing the music. And it was like, see, knowing that you're playing this music makes me want to cry. And he was like, and then when it changed to the Stevie Wonder song, he was like, oh, you're down. Yeah, and then that other woman, she was like, come over here, baby. And I went over there, and she was like, I have a question for you. And I was like, I know exactly the question you're gonna ask. She was like, what question am I gonna ask? And I said, you're gonna ask me how do I know this music? She was like, no. The first question I'm gonna ask is, are you Black? And I was like, no. She's like, so you don't got no Black in you. And I was like, because she was looking at me. She was like squinting her eyes, trying to see if maybe my grandfather's Black. And I was like, no, I'm full Chinese. And that's when she was like, yeah, I have this. But then the deep thing she said was, she was like, yeah, I want to kiss the person who taught you this music. But then she said, it's so good you know this music because you got a very good education. And then she said, if you know this music, then you know the streets. And she was like, it's very important that you know the streets because you got to be careful. You got to know how to approach people, and you got to know where you're at. And what she was saying is that the music is not just the music. The music teaches you something about the city, human beings. It teaches you something about how to navigate, how to operate, how to think, how to be. It's a whole thing within it. And then this other woman wanted me to dance with her, and she looked at me and she was like, come on, dance with me. I know you must have some soul in you. And yeah, people use words like that, soul. They use the word rhythm a lot. I've never heard it like that. They're like, do you got, they asked each other, you got rhythm or what? And part of it is that they're trying to examine something about me. They're like, we want to know, do you basically view the world more like a Black person? Are you still a human? Can you express yourself genuinely? Can you actually be a human being? Do you see us as human beings? Or are you something else, which is white? And that showed me, it showed me that I think unless you have these experiences, it's so easy. it's so easy to basically not see the Black community because it's the thing Du Bois talks about where it's like, no one, unless you're actually Black, like unless you're in it, you will not know what they're about to do. But the whole time they're watching, Black people are watching.
Yeah.
They're making their own decisions. They're switching their own parties, and not a single pollster will ever know. Because it doesn't matter if you're a pollster calling the Black community, they're gonna like, they might not say anything, they might lie to you. You will never know exactly what they're gonna do. And there's just something deep. And then that made a big impact on me. It was so deep because like it does show you a lot of leftists, progressives, whatever you want to call them, like it's very delusional because if you're not like, it's very detached from the people. You're very like, you will not understand. I don't care how much hip hop or whatever you listen to. It doesn't matter how much you can quote from Biggie or Tupac or whatever the fuck, or Beyonce, or everything is Black, whatever you understand is Black. Like you will not actually know the Black military. You will not actually know the community unless like unless you actually know Du Bois, you can view things like that unless you have these experiences. Like you will be delusional. You will actually be delusional. And yeah, that was pretty interesting. Yeah, and then like this one person who called my white coworker Anglo. She was like, I'm not even gonna ask you to dance because you Anglo. Because there is when the people talk about rhythm, or soul or spirit, it actually has to do with like, I think civilization, like the basics of civilization. That sounds abstract, but I mean it concretely, which is like they want to know are we human, and they also want, and I feel like that's what we talk about when we say Afro-Asiatic reconstitution. It's kind of like what you were saying about the basics of civilization. That's in there. Like it's not that different than Tagore. Like it's basically about like, do you still have what all civilization is based on? And it's the human. It's like it's the human. Because so much of American society is white. Like, it's white. When we say white, again, it's not just skin color. It's about like it's the moral choice, it's denial of the human. And yeah. So oh yeah, we talked about thinking.
Okay, I'm gonna try to tie it to like the rest of this conversation. So on Thursday afternoon, there were rallies around the city, there were protests, and then they made their way to Penn, and there was a faculty and staff walkout, which was very on the down low, in that I found out about it from my coworker, who found out about it from like a random email listserv that was not affiliated with Penn. It was at the Button, and faculty for Justice in Palestine were talking, and they were saying like, this is not okay, like all this stuff. And then suddenly students ran across the grass and then started setting up tents. And it was actually a really big like shock, and I think surprise for most of the Penn associated community, because the students had been doing it like very much on the down low. Like I didn't know about it, and yeah, this is happening in the context of all the other encampments that have been being set up this week. There's one at basically every Ivy League now, except for Dartmouth. And and the thing is, like, when that happened, I feel like everybody basically felt like a sigh of like, oh, like, thank God this is happening here too. Because I think for Penn, I was talking about it with like my coworkers, like grad students in the biology department, and everybody was wondering, like, does Penn have it? Like, do the Penn students have it in them? Like, knowing that there's like so much Zionism, like knowing how pre-professional this school is, and also like the threats from the administration, all of that, like, will the students still like have that to stand up? And it was pretty emotional actually seeing it happen, because it was like all of these like undergraduates basically. And as it was happening, like some students were setting up tents, and then all the undergrads were basically linking arms to like form a human chain. And I was standing there and I saw all these students I knew, like they were in my class that I TA for. There were Lotus, like a lot of the Lotus kids were actually like very much in it. And yeah, and then what I felt in that moment was that basically I think Penn students are also saying, like, if this is the time, like if this is the time of history and this is like what the moment is calling for, like we don't want to be found lacking. Like we want to do our best to be a part of it. Like we want to answer that call. Like we refuse to be left behind in it. And that moved me, but it also scared me because I don't think that they are fully, like ideologically prepared. Like basically, I think they had the courage of young people to want to take a leap and say like, this is what the time demands of us. Like we have to try. But ideologically, I think there's a lot of openness and basically confusion. Like logistically, I think there are obviously like organizers and activists who have been involved. Like there was an encampment last semester for like fossil-free pen to divest from fossil fuels. So they have some like logistical experience, but I don't think they have the ideological experience or the hardened like political experience. And so that's also why I think they're being supported by like JVP and the Philly Palestine Coalition. And so it's very interesting that it's students, but it's not just students. And I think that they're trying to basically reach and say like, yeah, we can't just do this as students alone. Like we have to actually reach for something broader. And I think they also recognize that Black people are important to Philadelphia, but the avenues by which they identify are like very imperfect, or like the things that they associate with are, for instance, like the Black Bottom or like Pam and Mike Africa, like Move. And it's also, I think, a function of like those organizations or like those types of activists also seeking to like immediately show up. Like Rick Kajewski immediately like showed up to speak. And and so it made me feel kind of worried, or just I felt like I needed to be there because once the Lotus students, like we've been reading together, and I realized that like for me personally, and like with the group having been reading, like I am connected to this too because I am a Penn student, and in some ways this is the best. Like I do see it as this is the best of what like Penn students can do or have been a part of in a very long time. And it was a really interesting, like social environment where for the first time it actually felt like people were like seeing each other and trying to be principled on a human level. And there were like a lot of interesting, like sociological anecdotes over the last 2 days. I guess, for instance, like, I think the students are really trying to figure out like, what are our tactics? Like what brought us together in the first place, which is Palestine, but also where do we go from here? How are we actually going to go about it? And there's obviously like unevenness where they're the activist core, but I also think there are just like ordinary students who have gotten pulled in and are saying like, yes, I'm here, not because like I have intersectional radical politics, but because there's a basic moral calling. And that was interesting to me because I met random people who were just standing and like basically forming the human chain, and people were just standing there for like 4 hours who were like, I want to make sure that this is going to be stable. Like I want to make sure it'll be there. And they're just like truly ordinary of a Penn student as you can get, where there's like this girl who she's like from Sacramento. She actually went to Harvard to like study biology, but then now she's a master's student in CS. And she had clearly not been involved in politics, but she was there. And then we were like talking, and then the next day I was like, oh, I wonder who's going to come. And so I texted her, and then she came by. And everybody, I feel like a lot of people have been waiting for this. But again, the question is like, where and how is it going to go? And I really resent, all of these like outsiders coming and projecting what they want, which is not like, first of all, I don't think it is actually grounded in like the human question or the category of the human being. Like a lot of it is basically the same old leftist agenda that they've had for probably 30 years. And because they recognize that this is a historical moment, they basically want to push and use the students to achieve whatever like thing that they've been wanting. And there are some concrete examples of this, like socialist alternative, like they're like flying. And I was there from like 10:30 in the morning to like the evening, night, like 8 p.m. And the demographics or like the atmosphere was very different in the morning because it was mostly just like students, people who had stayed overnight, and like, I guess like Penn people who have it together enough to show up in the morning. And so it was like calm. There was a de-escalation workshop led by like people from the Lawyers Guild. And they're actually basically practicing nonviolent resistance, where they're like, if like a Zionist counter protester tries to provoke you, like you do not push back. but you diffuse the situation. You say, I'm not doing this. And they're literally role playing it. And it reminded me of like the civil rights movement photos that we had found where they had to practice it. And they were all really, like, all the students, like I will say, were very committed to that concept where they're like, yeah, like we know that our cause is more like just, it's more true. Like we would actually like lose something by like falling to the level of like that kind of agitation. And also like we want to keep this encampment going. And so the socialist alternative guy, like the students would like sort of whisper to each other where they're like, no, like don't talk to him. Like we don't want your literature. They're like, he's kind of a weirdo. And so like that, I think that was kind of like, it's a small sign, but I think it shows something. And around lunchtime, that was when more and more outside people came because it was their lunch break. And actually there are 3 young like leftists who showed up. And it was because in the morning it had been kind of stable. It was kind of apparent when like these 3 random people just started sitting and they weren't talking to anybody else. Like they were just in their own bubble. And actually they were criticized, like they were completely just like complaining the entire time about the student movement. And they said they were eating the food of the encampment. They took like 7 bananas and they're just sitting and eating. And they're complaining. They're like, oh, like honestly, unless these students take a building, like unless they occupy a building or invite the houseless people on Penn's campus to come in, I'm not really interested. Like unless they escalate and like actually provoke the police, I'm not interested. And they're like, honestly, that I find this like attempt like really pathetic. The fact that it's Temple, Drexel, and Penn all together, and this is all they can do. And it was really like arrogant and just kind of appalling. And they felt like just West Philly, like anarchist cultural types, because they're like dyed hair, like they're very like artistic looking. And one of the, like, it was like 2 young women and then 1 man. And the young man was like wearing all black. He was like covering his face and then like eating a plate of food. And they're like, yeah, let's leave. This is so boring. Oh, and then they were like, yesterday they had been singing like protest songs, and it was like more in like the folksy, you know, like kind of white folk tradition, but they're also singing We Shall Not Be Moved. And they were also complaining about the singing, where they're like, oh, this is so lame, like this is so bad. And they're like, let's go. And they took their 7 bananas and all the food and just left. And it was interesting because I like was obviously listening and like kind of trying to take note of all of it. But what I noticed actually was that the people at like, there's this like girl I'd come with who's in my program, and she like looked at me as this was happening. She's like, this is so ignorant. She was like, this is really bad. And then after like they left, the undergraduates who had also been sitting, like we hadn't been talking that much, but they're like, did you hear that guy talking? And I think it's, yeah, like there's very clearly a lot of outside forces, and especially as it became closer to like evening and people got off work, like more and more outside community members were coming. And so I think there's and then also the tension is that like in the evening, like Philly Palestine Coalition kind of took the mic, and then they're shouting chants. And then it was like more like young men who I think were like wanting to be, it was 4 men, 1 woman, but the men were like the ones who were like, shout louder. And no, but then it was like free Palestine, and then I was like from the river to the sea. But then for the first time, this was not a chant I'd heard up to that point, but they were saying like oink oink piggy piggy, we're going to make your lives real shitty. And so it became like explicitly anti-police. And the Intifada one they had done the day before, but the police one was really interesting because you could sense that there's a lot of tension. There's tension and unresolved like ideological questions, and there's tension in terms of the question of tactics and what the fundamental goal is. Because I think the students in some ways are more like, it's ironic that in some ways the students are more grounded in like the concrete goals of like, we want to show solidarity with Palestine. We want to live up to this moment, and something specific and concrete that we want to do is we want to demand that our colleges divest from this monstrosity. And that's like a human question. And they know that they can't actually do it just on their own as students isolated, which is why they encourage and they want it to be open to basically Philadelphia. But then ironically, the people who are most interested in jumping on that bandwagon are a lot of activist types who I think want to want to provoke it and also like want to use the students to like purge something in themselves or to achieve their own goals that they otherwise can't. And so I think the question is like it is a fundamental ideological question, which is like, how are you going to ride that tension? Like, what are your assumptions? Who are you? And what, like, I do think this question of like, do you see yourselves as inheritors of like the Third American Revolution? Like, are you actually going to take up what the civil rights movement has shown? And I think by default, that will not be the case. Like, there was a lot of talk of like Audre Lorde, like there's much more references to like the Black Power end. And I think that's just because of the baggage of like the counter-revolution and what the students have gotten. I will say, I don't think they're that committed to it, but that is what they're working with. And that's also why I think the fact that the Lotus students are definitely like are part of it, and that Lotus is an organic part of the student body matters a lot. But what worries me is that things are moving so fast, and I wonder if like basically we've done enough, like whether it's enough. But I think like we are where we need to be in it, because also we've like the fact that we've been studying explicitly the civil rights movement this semester and reading Take Me to the Water, I think is really really important, because this week we were talking about how Baldwin is a philosopher, and all of the students they accept it immediately and very like personally to them. They're like, yeah, Baldwin is a philosopher. And somebody actually asked the question, they're like, why are there no schools of thought in the university about that are Baldwin? Why are there no intellectual successors who have taken on what Baldwin has been saying? And that became like a whole conversation, because we were talking about the Enlightenment, and we were like, well, it depends on what your chronology is. Like the people who have chosen to take on Baldwin do it where they try to reinterpret Baldwin or like shove him into the Enlightenment, like European postmodernist framework. And to actually understand Baldwin, you actually need to have a different chronology, which is like the Afro-Asiatic reconstitution, or like basically the chronology of recognizing slavery and the auction block and the blues. And so we were like talking very explicitly about what the category of the human being means. And we were like basically starting to talk about nonviolence and love and like the civil rights movement and all of that. And and so I think part of it is that I just feel like whether I like it or not, like I am a part of this, and I have to be, because like I know these students, and and I feel at this point like very responsible and what happens. But it's a lot of sorry, but I think it's kind of like things are almost just barely in time. If anything.
Things are almost.
It's like it's barely in time. Like if like I don't know if what we've done is like a strong enough foundation given, and then also how quickly things are escalating, which is that at this point I think students are likely to get arrested or suspended within like the next 24 hours. And basically things are escalating, and I think given like what's been happening at all the other universities, I think the students are going to say like, okay, like arrest us, like we're not backing down. But then like what spiritual reserves are you going to call on to continue through in that fight? And like, is it going to just get hijacked by like all of these leftist ideas? And so I think the stakes are high, but interestingly, I don't think that the students are just being blindly like funneled. Like I think that they're opening their eyes and trying to actually assess what's going on. I think. And then it's also interesting because one of the Penn professors was saying like, I've been so naive all this time. Like she was like, my eyes have been completely opened to like the hypocrisy. Like she teaches Arabic literature, but she's been given a lot of hate mail, and the Penn administration like 2 days ago finally sent out an email saying like, oh, like we've been hearing that there's like a lot of hate against like Palestinian students and Muslim students on campus. Like that's also bad. Like please don't start an encampment, basically. And like the thing is like the students and the faculty, like everybody is like, this is such a slap in the face. Like you think we're stupid, and like she basically said like, I've been so naive. I actually forwarded the president all of the hate mail that I was getting because I thought like maybe you would see, but now I know what side you're on. And she was like, it's too late. Like, it's too late for you to try to do anything about this. And so, I don't know, I think it is definitely an opening, but the human factor, like everyone was saying, is actually the most important part. And that's the part that I'm worried will not be like adequately emphasized or like dug into as these things go on. Yeah.
I don't know if anyone wants to add more about the encampments. Because then after we can go to yeah. I think Doc would hear that.
I wanted to say one thing. I actually was thinking about this since the time you mentioned that you went to South Carolina, and I was reminded that in Taking to the Water, Baldwin also describes his trip to the South, having been born in New York and having experienced something that is very uniquely off the North, and having gone to the South, he says that he experienced a certain kind of terror. And when he came back to New York, he went to his friend's house and he didn't get out for 5 days. And he was just lying in bed. And he describes the South as something extremely different from the North. And he points out that this terror, it does not come from a place of seeing Black people in the South. It comes from seeing white people in the South and what has become of them. That's the terror that kept him inside his house for 5 days. And I think I wanted to read out one small part of this, and I think it ties a little bit into this. The way that I'm thinking about it, how does the white person redeem himself in this legacy that we've been talking about? And he says, furthermore, this terror can produce its own antidote, an overwhelming pride and rage, so that whether or not one is ready to die, one gives every appearance of being willing to die. And at that moment, in fact, since retreat means accepting a death far worse, one is willing to die, hoping merely to drag one's murderer along. Not many among the redeemed have any sense of this passion which they describe, without knowing how profoundly they are describing themselves as suicidal. They mean that it is suicidal to contend with a force obviously or apparently greater than oneself, and that they would never dream of doing such a thing. They also mean that they, by definition, by their numbers, are the greater force, and they never suspect to what merciless level of contempt this oblique and arrogant confession exposes them. A man who knows that he is facing death, or more accurately, who knows that it is, after all, he himself who has insisted on and brought about this moment, may involuntarily, helplessly shout or weep, or even piss or shit in his pants where he stands, but he will not turn back. To turn back is no longer among his possibilities. That is why he may shout or weep, and his stink may fill the air. He has brought himself to this moment, and this is he, if only for a moment, he. And the others are beneath him and anonymous forever, because they value their manhood less than he. And I think, to an extent, what Nuri was pointing out, that these people who are part of this present student movement, they have the will and they have the strength and the courage, but they lack the ideology which brings a different kind of courage, a different kind of
quality. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. And I think I've been thinking about this, knowingly or unknowingly, they are following in the steps of the civil rights movement,
Yeah.
and the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. And I think that the next step is to recognize it. And once you recognize something,
Then you see, the thing is to make it their own. And that's their first line of defense against the distractors and the misleaders.
I was thinking that there's, in some ways, the tension that there is between like sort of the simple morality, or in some ways like this question of equality, or like exposing the hypocrisy or the double standards, and like freedom. But then that can also turn into kind of a liberal, like free speech, like let's just like treat everybody the same type of thing.
Definitely.
But then also I think in some ways that's the entry point for a lot of people, where they're like, this is a basic question, like this is so wrong, and I know that it's wrong. And then I feel like there are like the radical, like intersectional, like every issue is every other issue, and like if we're going to do this, we should abolish all the prisons, and like this actually shows that like, I don't know, like all of whatever, like we should like attack the police, like that kind of like crazy everything suddenly. But I think what actually is like, but then
performative revolution.
yeah, performative revolution. But then also that's where a lot of people throw in like the Black liberation struggle. That's what it gets associated with. And I feel like the question is, what is like the way through, or like what is actually the solution? And I think it is like actually the Black freedom movement, like the Black freedom movement, the civil rights movement. And it's also especially important when we talk about the world situation, because actually it's through the Black freedom movement that we find like Palestine, we find Afro-Asia. And it is this time, like even what we were talking about with like King and the civil rights movement, and how the vanguard of that movement ended up in the World Peace Council.
Yes.
Like there is like a very natural connection there. And I think it's that's the only place that like all of us can go.
Can I just say, this is very significant. And, you know, by the way, happy birthday, Mumi Abdul Jamal. His birthday was 2 days ago, 70 years old. But you see, this is you hit on something. MOVE is not a revolutionary organization. Never was and is not now. But it has this appearance. And what you all are saying is real. It's not something somebody told me. I know it. It was Trotskyist and anarchist organizations that defined MOVE as the vanguard of the Black struggle. I mean, so that just what you pointed out, Nori, then, okay, so the civil rights movement is not revolutionary. The Black Power movement, what they know, and who is the vanguard or the most advanced of the Black Power movement? MOVE. Never was true. And this is what is being, you could see it being played out.
Yeah, well, because also yesterday, as we were leaving the encampment, I think they were, like people, I think it was Philly Palestine Coalition people who were also, like they were doing this like chant for like free ants, like free ants.
Free ants. That's what I mean by everything just gets thrown in.
Yeah, but like, the thing is that, you know, like I think the students, like, like they recognize that there is a kind of moral authority in Black people, but basically the Black people they're presented with are basically like the ultra left,
the misleadership, exactly the misleadership.
And I think that like you can feel like the even in the chants, it's like people are very like they're very enthusiastic about like, you know, the Free Palestine thing, like all of the chants that have become very popular in this moment. But it's like, yeah, the moment in which they're starting to do like the whole, like the piggy will make your life shitty, like that whole thing.
People are like, wait, I don't know.
Like you can like, but then they're trying to like almost like shame the students.
No, it's the thing I think of, like the question of what is unity, because I think like what is unity, and I think the answer is like basically the category of the human being. And because actually the most moving speaker to me was actually the Penn professor, because she was saying like, I know it's wrong when like a child in Gaza is killed, like I know it, and that means that I have to speak out. I don't care what happens anymore, like I know it's right. And yeah, like that actually felt to me closer.
See, that's the key. You're
Yeah.
right. You know, and in these anarchists, there is no category
No,
of the
there's no.
human.
Yeah, and so I think
And
like
Fred Hampton Jr. is not Fred Hampton. I don't know Fred Hampton Jr. that well, although I know him. Not a bad guy, nice guy to a certain extent, but he's not his father,
yeah.
whom I knew also. So, you know, all of this performance and we're the Black Revolution. No, you're not. But I'm sorry.
No, but I think it's that there's confusion where I think the category of the human being, like that universal, and then how that brings together both like Palestine and the Black freedom movement, like that's enough. Like that's enough.
That's right.
But I think because and I think it's similar to how we say like the question of war and peace is like a big enough question that actually any group or any person who comes in, like that's a basis for principled unity. And there's a possibility of transformation and actually like coming together and advancing and developing along that fundamental principle. And I feel like with Palestine, like it's the same thing. But if you then try to basically cater or to get the support of these outside forces by saying like, oh, like we'll cater to your issue, like I think that becomes a big problem. And I don't think that's exactly where they're going, but that's the other like thing about I think this spontaneous like form of politics, which is also just a very like youthful college type thing.
Yeah, because something that like I think you said yesterday as we were talking about it was, this question of tension, because the encampments themselves are designed to create a specific kind of tension on campus. And that
A creative tension.
Yes, exactly.
Tension. And I think there's always, like also with like the whole liberal thing, there's always a danger where on the one hand, it can just kind of devolve into like, oh, it's just like it's like everyone's chill, like we're all just having a good time.
It's a harmless,
like everyone's just chilling on campus. And that's also where the university's fine with it, actually. The universities are fine with it just being kind of like a chill, like nothing's really happening. People are just having a good time, like hanging out, like that whole thing. And sometimes it does kind of feel like that, at least from what I was able to observe. But then the other side is like, oh, like when the people who are more like radical or leftist or see themselves in that way are trying to push a really bad kind of tension, where it's basically just agitation for the sake of agitation because they're like, oh, like we want to push the students to get arrested, basically. And I think, obviously, like the students already know, like any student who shows up is like, oh, I know that I could get arrested because everyone's been seeing all the images of like, like Columbia, like Ohio State, like USC, like all these universities where like students are getting literally like beat up by the police, and like UT Austin, all that stuff. And so like students already know they're coming into it with a certain like preparedness of like, oh, like if I need to be, like I think I would be willing to like go through that and suffer the consequences. But then there's like like this whole thing of like you're basically trying to impose like a negative kind of tension, which doesn't actually lead to like an advancing movement of consciousness where it's like, like the blueprint for actually how to do, like you said, creative tension is literally the civil rights movement, where it's like you're using tension in a very creative and productive way, where it actually leads to an advancement in the people and the capacity and all that stuff. And because the other thing that, like when you're walking towards the encampment on campus, you can feel it almost, especially as you get closer. Like there's some students who are walking, like not the Zionists, but there's students who are like they're trying to pretend as if things are normal, and they're trying to pretend as if like life is just proceeding naturally.
They're wearing their formal
They're like,
clothes,
they're trying to like, like do like their whole thing, like dress up. Because it's like the end of the semester. People are trying to take graduation photos. People are trying to go like their nice formal dinners and stuff like that. But it's like, and this is like when you learn about the history of the civil rights movement, this is also what the students of National were trying to do, where it's like it created an environment where the undecided, the students had to decide like, oh, what's wrong with me that I'm not being part of this. And I think that's also a creative form of tension as well, where the students who are like sitting in the back, they're still observing, they're trying to decide like, oh, like, am I part of this or am I not? But it's like, like, I think the other thing that like is very profound is that the students realize that they're part of something which is basically a world historic moment.
Yeah.
And that places a pressure and a responsibility on you to be like, oh, actually, like the decisions that we make matter. Because it's like literally you're also able to see like, yeah, like Bisan, one of like the foremost like leading like journalists from Gaza, like this young woman who basically like an entire generation of young people around the world like look to her as like their kind of like moral anchor for understanding what's happening in Gaza. Yeah, like she put out this video immediately that was saying like, yeah, like because she's been like so depressed recently because of all the stuff that's been happening, but like this was like the first time that she was like really like passionate and like excited, I think, especially after stuff that's been happening. But you know, like you also see these photos of like people from Yemen and people from Gaza and like Rafah and camps there, like basically like putting up signs like students in America, like we support you, like we're proud of you, like you give us strength and we want to give you strength. You know, so like the students realize that they're part of the world moment, the world historic moment, and it's like because you're conscious of that, it's like, oh yeah, the decisions that we make matter. And it's like you're having to like actually like this is something that you were saying, it's like real politics is happening as opposed to like the fake performative politics that students are so used to. And like that's what's also pushing students, I think, to talk to one another in a way which is a little unusual, especially for Penn, where there's such a almost like a atmosphere of conformity that is so common. And I mean, I say all this also as an outsider in a lot of ways because I'm just trying to like observe like what's going on and how the students are relating to each other. But you can feel it, like especially as you're walking towards it, there's like a tension that like is building in the air where it's like, yeah, it's also one between the students who are at the encampment and the students who are just trying to act as if life is normal. But it's like you know that life's not normal. You know that something's happening. And the question is like how are you going to relate to it?
Yeah, definitely.
So I think that just a student, like basically, I feel like their destiny is to actually try to become a student worth movement, not just like SDS, but one actually more like at the level of the civil rights movement. And I feel like that would be proof of like the idea that the American people are becoming one people. That like that the qualities of like the Black proletariat can like are universal and can be adopted, like can be embraced by like all young people. And the thing is that I think that is the question of whether like, and like this sounds really dramatic, but I think whether like if that happens or like whether or not that happens, that will be like the deciding factor of whether the movement actually like succeeds or fails ultimately. And that's what makes me feel really like scared or just concerned for this moment because I think it matters, like it actually matters.
Yeah, state a brief observation. So this is like for me, this was like the first like peaceful protest, I guess, that I went to. Like some of the other ones, I remember I drove past I-95 and I saw everyone walking down I-95 a few months ago. But this one, it was like refreshing to see like people just their nonviolent resistance. But it was disheartening seeing the anarchists there. I saw them too. They were kind of just like going around like threatening, like, looking threatening. I don't know.
Yeah, they were like sulking around.
Yeah. But one thing I noticed that was super beautiful was I actually saw like, because Philly has a large Palestinian community, and I saw people bringing their kids there, you know, and I thought that was amazing. And I think that people should think about that, like trying to foster a peaceful environment that, you know, people from the city might want to come to.
Actually, yeah, because one of my lab mates, he has a toddler and he was like running because he's training for a marathon, but like he was the one who told me about the faculty protest. Like we talked, and I think he's like Anabaptist and he's like more kind of into the Unitarians and stuff. So we've been having some like deep conversations lately. And so I told him like, oh, actually they just started setting up tents. And he's like, let me run to campus. And I was like, oh, I thought he was just gonna like run, but he actually ran with a stroller and brought his toddler. And like he was like taking like pictures of his baby. But it's like that's possible.
Yeah, see, the protesters can never be the provocateurs of violence. You always allow, and that's part of the tactic, the reactionaries, the authorities to provoke the violence because it exposes them and it takes the movement to another level. And you're right, I agree with you, Jerry, that piggy and all of that. That ain't got nothing to do with this, man. You know, if you want to do that, you create your own
Well,
movement.
because
Don't
it's also
come in
it's
here.
so disrespectful because also
Oh,
at
yeah.
the encampment, like there was so much food that got donated,
Yeah.
and some of it was obvious. Like I think some of it was like mutual aid networks, but also just people who are
Yeah.
really like who wanted to like support.
Yeah.
And it was like I was trying not to eat because I was like, I want to save food for like the people who are actually camping overnight. But I'd been there for like 9 hours, so I was kind of hungry. And then no. Well, but then when I went, there was like it was also I think it was students from the Muslim Student Association and the Arab Student Association who are trying to like also pass like a referendum now on like whether students want to divest. But they were serving food. And so it's interesting to see like that level of organization where those students seemed like, yeah, like really normal, ordinary Penn students. But they were like, oh, actually, like people have been cooking food and they dropped it off and it's homemade. And it was like this saffron rice and like chicken. And it was like really thoughtful. And like you could taste the saffron. And I was like, yeah, like somebody actually cooked, like somebody cooked this like with love. Like they're not just donating like, oh, like here, have like, I don't know, like the trash groceries that got left out or like the three-day old like baked goods. Like it was like a family that actually cooked it and like in one of those aluminum pans. And that's where I was like, yeah, like there are a lot of leftists and like anarchists or whatever in the mix, but there also are, I think, like people. And like I think the students like surely must feel that responsibility. Like if you're eating that food and you know that somebody brought it for you because they want you to be like sustained. They don't want you just to like eat granola bars for 5 days straight. Like I don't know. There are like actually I think some like civilizational elements to it.
Okay, maybe we end with Tagore.
Okay, no. I think it will be short because we covered a lot of it last time. So this is just an update on the event that happened in India on April 13, celebrating the 100th anniversary of Tagore's trip to China in 1924. And this was the first of a series of events this year on this, for this commemoration. And this one was the inauguration of a 10-day-long exhibition, which had historical photographs of Tagore's trip, but also India-China historical relations in general. And it was the inauguration, the exhibition was inaugurated by the Chinese Consul General from Mumbai, Kong Xianhua, and ex-ambassador Lata Reddy, who was a long time served in the foreign service. She was in South Africa and Thailand, and she was also the ex-deputy national security advisor. It was really a beautiful event, and the video recording for the presentations that people gave is available. Definitely worth watching. But just to briefly summarize the main ideological points that were raised was to use the memory of Tagore's trip to China to establish the basis for historical relations between the Indian and Chinese people and the rich history of cultural and philosophical exchange that it was like a landmark event that engendered this rich exchange between India and China. And when I say cultural exchange, I don't just mean culture as in the culture of the elites, the culture, the folkways, the culture that's produced by the life world of ordinary people. That is what it generated. And the Chinese people remember Tagore's visit, and literature and literature, the poetry in general has been deeply influenced by Tagore in that country. And Tagore is taught to Chinese children in the textbooks and so on. But the other thing that I wanted to mention, I mean, I've said all of these before. I'm trying to remember what I did not say last time, but the other thing I think I want to mention is also how the event wanted to highlight Tagore's concept of Pan-Asian unity and Pan-Asia as not just a geographical or simply cultural category, but a political and historical category, which has a role to play in this moment in figuring out what the future of not just Asia, but the whole world is going to be. So these were some of the things that this event touched upon or started the conversation for. And there's also a subsequent event this coming Sunday at a college in Bangalore, same city, which will have again a panel discussion on Tagore's thought, its influence on India and China, but also its world historic significance. But then it's also going to have a cultural segment where there's the reading of Tagore's work, but also music and dance in the school, in the tradition that Tagore started in India. And just to go back to the event from April 13, it got a lot of press interest and coverage. So, there were a couple of leading Indian newspapers, the Hindu, Indian Express, that reported and even shared the photographs from the exhibition. And then in China, I guess China Daily, but then also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China reported, and especially the fact that the consul general from Bombay, this is two consul generals in India for China, traveled all the way to attend this, marked the significance of what this event was trying to start a conversation for. And then I also wanted to mention that Raju, so by the way, this event was organized by our colleagues Raju and Nandita, but also in partnership with the Gandhi Global Family. And prior to the event, Raju had written this essay on the importance of Tagore and the importance of commemorating this particular historic event, his trip to China. And that essay was published by Kishore Mahbubani's institute, Asian Peace Program. So
In Malaysia.
Kishore Mahbubani, a Singaporean diplomat, very sharp political comment.
Very important.
And then after that, it was the same essay was republished in South China Morning Post, but also Zhang Weiwei's Thinkers Forum republished it. And then there was another version of that essay in an Indian newspaper, India Forum, and it also inspired a lot of different people speaking on the same topic. There was another essay on, wait, I wrote it down. There was another essay in Eurasia Review, another essay in the South China Morning Post trying to understand the significance of this event. And several events have been organized in China, probably independently, but maybe not, after this conversation was started, because Kishore Mahbubani told Raju that he had sent his essay to 1,000+ high-level, and then a lot of these things happen. So there is that question of this being an interconnected phenomenon. So there were events organized at Tsinghua, Shenzhen, and Peking universities. There was something done by the National Institute of International Strategy in collaboration with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And there's also a conference being planned for May that will be in Beijing. Again, all of this commemorating the 100th anniversary of Tagore's trip to China. So, this is significant and important, especially given what the US is preparing to, with sending of its of more weapons and naval groups to the Asia Pacific region. And this is very important right now. It's timely because India and China basically have to figure out, India especially basically has to figure out which side of history it's going to be on. And using this historical basis for what China-India peace and friendship has been or has looked like, what the basis for that is very important right now, because in so many ways, the narrative has been so dominated by Western propaganda and misinformation, And Tagore seems to me as a symbol almost but also, yeah, I get emotional. But yeah, as representative of that organic human level connection between the peoples of India and China, and the need to rediscover the basis of relationships unmediated by the West at the level of culture and civilization of people, not governments, not merely governments, just at the level of people. So, yeah, that's my update. I rushed through it because but yeah, we can make like a repository of all the stuff that's happening, and yeah, people are interested.
No, I just want to say, I guess, congratulations, but this is also coming out of preschool. Like all of these accomplishments are so significant, like it's crazy. Kishore Mahbubani is like huge, like a big deal,
Yeah, really.
like a really big deal. But also like the Council General, all of these individuals that have been involved, but specifically also like picking up on the message that Raja and Nanda are trying to put together. And it shows that there's the potential there for India and China. But in some ways it's prophetic because I feel like in preschool, like our closest friend, like my closest friends are Indian. And I'm like, why is it? Of course it makes all the sense that India and China, like that's where they belong. But yeah, it just makes me really emotional too, to hear about that.
Yeah, because I think it's also like in some ways the like what Tagore means for Indian and Chinese people, it's also in some ways a reflection of what we're also trying to do in free school, where it's like I really like the line that Shimbarto and Porto you wrote in your essay on science, where it's like history is useful to the living if it can be used. And it's like we use Baldwin as, like we've said, a meeting ground for people. Like Tagore serves as like a meeting ground for Indian and Chinese people, where it's a reminder for ordinary people of like, oh yeah, like this is one where we come from, but also like what we're capable of. Like Baldwin for us also this year, it's like he's a meeting ground for all kinds of people, but he serves as a reminder, or even just he shows you like what human beings like in this country are capable of becoming. And yeah, it was interesting because I saw this article, sort of related, but I saw this article from, I think this is like Xinhua News about the 69th anniversary of the Bandung Conference, where I think next year being the 70th anniversary of Bandung in April, I think it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. I think they're like China's really leaning into officially like, oh yeah, like we were part of Bandung, this is what this means, the principles of like peaceful coexistence, but also this article is talking a lot about like the concept of like a new Asia, new Africa, and how all of this was emerging from the Bandung movement.
Could you share that?
Yeah. But yeah, I feel like China in particular is taking it very seriously because this is also part of the future world that China is trying to build together with all of its partners across the global south, basically.
I just wanted to say one more thing is, it just even learning that Tagore is so loved in China that people can quote him from memory. I mean, it's a very emotional thing because first of all, we're basically from the part of India where Tagore was from, right? So as Bengalis, and I keep saying this, but even when in the India reading group we were reading Tagore together, I used to keep saying this, that I personally have had a difficult relationship with Tagore just because of the imposition of him as something that I was naturally supposed to just be I don't know, just accept as, I'm losing all my words, but basically ever since I was a child, I was it was imposed upon me. Tagore was like, oh, he's this figure, he's a Bengali hero, and you have to accept him. And I think in children, it made me want to stay away because I didn't understand the basis on which I was being asked to revere this man. What was the basis? I didn't understand, and the cultural element just did not seem enough to me. But it was only when we started reading the depth of his philosophical thought, and how you could see that he loved every Chinese person that he met, on his trip, that he loved Asia, and he actually believed that Asians had a role to play in the world. That's when I realized that yes, of course I love Tagore, And the reason I say this is that there is a kind of dogmatic respect that is paid to Tagore by Bengalis, but when you hear about how the Chinese people see him, that's when you realize what a person like him means as a world figure. And in one of the reports that they did for the exhibition in the China Daily, I think it was, the photograph they used to, start off the report for the event on April 13th. The caption said that it was basically from an event that was in Shanghai High School, where they were watching on Zoom somebody from the Tagore International School. I don't know what that is, but a young student from that school, reciting Tagore in Chinese. And all these Chinese students watching this Indian student recite Tagore in Chinese. I mean, I don't know. It's very emotional for me, but when you realize that there is no other way to see Tagore but this, as this man.
And there's no other way to see India. He is the lens that India must be seen. I think this is very, very important. Any other way, let me just say, you cannot see India through the lens of Hinduism, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It must be seen through the lens of Tagore, Gandhi, Nehru, the freedom struggle. And once you see that, then everything else in India makes sense, and the future makes sense.
Yeah, and Indians have to see it.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, first Indians. That was a great event, a great, it's so beautiful. I can understand the emotion of it for Indians and Chinese. And it says something so profound about the quality of Chinese people in China, that they revere Tagore in spite of, which means they see India through Tagore and not through the tensions. But
Because the only report I read was the one from the National Ministry, which is a huge deal. The fact that an organ of the People's Republic of China is talking about this event is a huge deal. And I feel bad because when we were organizing the China conference, like the conference celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China, I think I didn't take enough of this seriously. And I think I also dismissed like a lot of the phrasing. Well, because I think when you translate Chinese to English, some of it sounds like weird. Like shared, like Xi Jinping thought is defined. So Xi Jinping thought is like an embrace, like ideology of the Chinese state people and the party, similar to like Mao Zedong thought and Deng Xiaoping thought, but like Xi Jinping thought is, so like there's been a move, we talked about like there's been a move to not just talk about socialism, but socialism with Chinese characteristics, with an emphasis on Chinese characteristics, which is an interesting move because what they're saying is they're trying to emphasize something civilizational as a defining force of revolution in China, not the socialism, but actually that Chinese civilization allowed for them to see the value of Marx and Lenin, whatever. So, but Xi Jinping thought it's defined by terms like shared future for mankind. And like these words are not, I think I didn't take seriously these words, like national rejuvenation, shared future for mankind. There's a purpose to Xi Jinping thought. And like the way the Communist Party works in China is they actually do that thing where every few weeks or whatever, they give memos to party members. And I know this because my grandpa still reads them. So like he gets them in the mail, he prints it out, he looks at it, even though he's 95. And like you're actually supposed to study it as a cadre. And there's a reason why. There's something about it. But in the report from the National Ministry, like they basically see this event as part of their program, but also shows something about China where like the whole point is like they basically talked about how like, yes, this event is exactly like what we want, China wants, the people of China wants to party, which is not just India and China, but that if India and China together, like as a representation of what should be really a pan-Asia, like an Asia cooperation thing, that we can shift the pendulum of human history, that we can do our role in shifting the pendulum of human history. And to me, that was also really emotional. And like then there are terms like common development, like it kind of sounds maybe dogmatic if you just read it and such, but actually it's not. What they're trying to say is they're trying to reinfuse into the language of a whole people the categories of like win-win, like human collaboration. Like we don't believe in imperialism, basically. We don't believe in the domination or subjugation of one for another. We believe that humanity is bound. And that's like, Gandhi and Kingian, it's all the same like stuff. And
peaceful coexistence.
Peaceful
With
coexistence.
the emphasis on peace.
Yes.
Nonviolent cooperation.
Yeah, no, it made me emotional because it is true where like with the escalation in China, because what America wants to do is it wants to drag South Korea in, it wants to drag Japan in, it wants to drag peoples whose civilization do not belong with that. And the hope is that if Asia and China, in China and India can begin a certain shift, then it will help make it easier for the South Korean people or the Korean people. Like it can help make it easier for other Asian peoples to take a stand. And yeah, so that's why it's also really emotional. Oh, I was telling Raja, I was like, this sounds stupid, but I think what you and Nandita have done is already, basically, you've already contributed to world history. Like, that's the sense I get. And I was like, as kind of like someone somewhat of an outsider looking in at what you're doing, like I know that what you've done already belongs to the eternal. Like it's you're contributing like in a world way, which is pretty immense. Oh, but yeah, I'm really down. I'm also down for the idea to celebrate Tagore and Baldwin on the 7th. On Tagore's birthday.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh yeah, as part of preschool. Yeah. Something about the human. Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know if it's 2:10. Maybe you don't. Should we do comments? Okay. If you'd like to know what our commenters are thinking, you can read the comments afterwards. But we had some really beautiful comments. And we'll end here. And another wonderful preschool. We'll see you all next week.